Take one.
The doobly-doo.
Who wrote the doobly-doo? I might want to adopt that, like rather than saying the episode description, because that's boring.
Who wrote the doobly-doo?
You know, like, and you'll find links and stuff in the doodly-doo.
Oh,
the
is
doobly-doo.
Is it doodly-doo?
I think there's variations.
Or doobly-doo.
I kind of like doobly-doo better.
But what it just means in the
Doobly-doo.
thingy? It's just like in the thingy-ding.
Yeah, like in the descriptory space block thing.
Oh my God, if I Google doobly-doo, it says doobly-doo YouTube comes up and then doobly-doo song.
The doobly-doo song?
So is it always the same person? Doobly-doo, Urban Dictionary. The term refers to the video description box on YouTube. Yeah. So that's a literal thing.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's a whole thing.
The doobly-doo is this box which contains information about the video, links, and tags, used to be universally referred to as the sidebar, since it often appeared beside videos. But Craig Benzine, also known as Wheezy Waiter. God.
Oh, gee.
I've never felt so old in my life.
Internet history.
Started referring to it as the doobly-doo. Wow. Other YouTubers, such as John Green, part of the Vlog Brothers, and Dan...
The Vlog Brothers.
And Dan Brown started to also call the sidebar the doobly-doo, using Wheezy Waiter's terminology. The term is now widely used on YouTube.
Yeah.
So the sidebar is... I don't even know what the sidebar means.
The sidebar, like, it's just the details. It's the
details are below. They're not on the side.
I feel like maybe in a past era, like before the YouTuber days.
I'm pulling up YouTube right now. And
I mean,
you point to me, tell me what the sidebar is.
Yeah, but the interface for YouTube has changed drastically over the years.
Really? Has it? Because I don't know if it has. So. I guess this article is from 2009. Jesus.
Do we include slurping sounds from drinks? We should.
I don't know.
We just...
Get that throat coat in. And we just lost everyone.
Everybody's gone.
So, you know what is on my mind kind of lately?
What?
Yesterday I was at this thing, which, cheers, by the way, if you hear Jay's ice clinking, it's because he poured us some nice whiskey.
Cheers. This is the whiskey my dad got me for my birthday. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's delicious. Thanks, Dad.
Yeah. So this
sponsored this episode.
Yes.
Yay!
This episode of Reality Quest is sponsored by Woodford Reserve Double Oaked Whiskey.
Oh yeah. And those cool silicone square ice things that you got the ice cube out of.
Oh yeah.
Those are great.
Oh, that's funny. So this is the most hipster possible thing that I could be doing right now. But I was subscribed to Bespoke Post, which is super hipster, but it's also like actually like really interesting stuff. Like they have this. What is this called? What are
the glass? What are you
not
going
the glasses.
For?
There's like whiskey glasses here, and there's these giant ice cubes that I got, and then it was a set that came with the holder.
Oh, the glass.
The glass. Yeah, it's for holding your whiskey or
I know what you mean.
Yeah, it's not a carafe. That's for tea. I always forget this name.
Whiskey holder. Let's see what comes up. Decanter?
It's a decanter. God.
That's for wine too. Why are you so frustrated by that, man? Calm down.
That word, like literally
you just can never think of decanter?
Yes.
Oh,
every
I know
time
what you mean.
I'm trying to think of, I got this thing, and I can never think of the word decanter. Decanter.
What is that about? Honestly, I want to just talk about memory, but
Memory?
we can do that another time. But why do we forget? Why is there with the same word, you tend to be blocked by it?
I don't know.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
I mean, that's basically what you just said.
Yep. That is exactly what's been happening. It's that particular word. I know there's a number of words like that in my vocabulary that always are really hard for me to recall on like when I want them. Right. Intentionally too.
And I wonder how much that has to do with the more you're blocked by something, the more panicky you get when you're trying to remember it.
I think that's exactly why this happens, is because you start to associate a little bit of stress and anxiety around recalling that word.
Yeah.
And I think I'm anticipating when I get into a sentence and I'm like, that's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say that word. I better remember it.
Right.
Fuck, I can't remember the word.
Yeah, it's like you set yourself up for failure.
Yeah, no, it totally is. That happens all the time.
Okay, so the thing that's been on my mind, which is, oh, by the way, welcome to Reality Quest, everyone.
Welcome
back. This is a Thoughts on Thoughts episode, which means Jay and I chat about things on our mind sometimes that is related to the previous episode we released.
Some of it definitely will be.
And then we do our own adventure related to that. It's typically inspired by the previous episode.
Yeah, it's just like mental spelunking into the minds of Kelly and Jay.
I love the word spelunking.
Spelunking.
So this actually has nothing to do with the topics of today, but because it was on my mind recently, I was at a bachelor watching thing yesterday.
Like a bachelor gathering.
Yes. Batch Nation.
A batch commune. Sure. I don't know what you call that.
Sure.
I have not jumped onto that wave.
Anyways, I was referencing this person who was previously on The Bachelor, and I said,
Okay.
you know, that person couldn't remember her name, and I said, she has a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody's reaction was an eye roll with everybody has a podcast now. It's just like, okay.
I mean, whatever.
Well, but I think that was interesting because I think she was probably referring to the fact that all of the Bachelor people have podcasts,
Oh,
but
really?
I've also, a lot of them do, not everyone, but some of them will end up having podcasts. They build their own brands. They're human beings.
Yeah, they're public figures at this point because they're being watched every
week. They can kind of do whatever the fuck they want. And as we all can, as a reminder.
Oh yeah, we all are allowed to do whatever the fuck we want.
So, but I heard this from other people too. And everyone, I don't know, I think you and I talked about it in the beginning when we started talking to people about the fact that we were doing a podcast. And I feel like I got a lot of eye rolls from a lot of people about podcasts in general, and then also doing a podcast in the VR industry. It's like, oh my God.
Eye rolls for both? Like a double roll?
A double eye roll.
If I may. A two-eyed roll.
So that gave me pause. Of course, it annoyed the shit out of me in the beginning because I was like, okay, maybe I shouldn't do it then.
Immediate imposter syndrome attack.
Right. But here's my griping. So everyone can have a website, everyone can have a blog, and for some reason, when it comes to YouTubing and podcasts, everyone's like pissed off that anyone can do it.
I feel like blogs also are in that same bag.
What do you mean, that people get annoyed by it?
Yes. Only that people often get irritated or just kind of like personally frustrated maybe, that they're not... This could be very judgmental sounding, but I feel like it often stems from a little bit of like self-conscientiousness that, like, it's associated with people being very egotistical or like overly confident or over sure of themselves to the point where you're like, the things I have to say have value and people want to hear what I have to say.
Right.
You don't have to have that attitude, obviously. Like, I think we've been really trying to avoid that sort of talk, but I don't know. I haven't really picked that apart myself.
I think that there's something to that, and it makes me want to pick it apart because on the one hand, I totally get where people are coming from. And on the other hand, I just think, well, who the fuck cares? Like, why are you so upset about it? You could make a statement that there's a difference between saying, wow, podcasts have really blown up lately. A lot of people have them. Compared to, oh my God, everybody has a podcast now. Or, oh my God, everybody's a YouTuber. It's like, okay, what's your personal problem with that?
So, well, okay, maybe let's step back and look at this from like the pro cons real quick. So what is the downside of everybody and their mother having a podcast or a blog or writing their own book or whatever?
The downside for me is that I have too many options, the same as on Netflix. I'm inundated with options of great things to listen to.
Well, great things sometimes and many shitty things.
Right,
Usually,
but who cares? If it's shitty, it's like anything else. If I try a new music or I try a new show and I don't like it, I move on. I don't get angry at that person for having the gall to put that out there.
For stepping outside of their comfort zone and being like, I'm gonna put some sort of content or material out. I'm gonna do that thing.
Right. Like Spotify comes out, I'm like, ugh. You think you can make music too? Ugh.
Yeah, God,
like
there's so many musicians. There's so many artists out there. It's just too much. Too much good music.
Like, how many movies and shows are there? I mean, honestly. And nobody's like, how on earth, why is everyone making a show now?
I think Wired actually published. It was not that official. It was an Instagram post. It's totally just an Instagram post that was like, there was somebody counted it up and there's like 627,000 shows, like official TV show type programming to watch, or channels, whatever.
Yeah.
If you want to collect from all the different networks and whatnot together. So there's never been more of a problem of having too many things to watch. But I don't feel like that's a problem.
I think that the difference is that when it comes to TV shows and musicians, there's a distance there where somebody who's listening to that or watching something, they think those people have been approved by somebody, because oftentimes it's going through some sort of producer or distribution company where they feel like if everybody can podcast, there's some sort of like, some people deserve that and some people don't feeling of like, how dare you feel that you can put yourself out there.
You deserve to be on a public pedestal like that.
Right. I had this recent conversation. This person I'm working with is a professional copywriter, also a screenwriter. And he feels very frustrated by everyone feeling like they can write. And of course, we all do. We all feel like we can write. We all feel like we can. It's the same thing with UX design. A lot of people think they can be a designer when it comes to making decisions.
It's the same thing with programming. We had this conversation with Michael about C, just the C programming language in general, C++, whatever, these like low-level programming languages versus when languages like JavaScript come along and it's really accessible because it's in every browser and everybody is able to jump on there and start poking around. The smaller originals, like the niche groups, the tribes that got started earlier, and maybe they feel like objectively they had to put more effort into learning those things. They feel there's like a pride and ego associated with that. And so I feel like that happens in every single area, whether it's you perceive it as somebody that you're not, like people on TV shows or celebrities. Somehow they earned that space, and if everybody is able to jump on and make a podcast or a YouTube channel, it somehow, from that perspective, it like devalues what it means to be a public celebrity or figure or whatever.
Right, which that whole concept of earning, who really defines that? I think this is the difference, because let's talk about with movies. So previously in Hollywood, it was all through production companies. And now there's various things that people can do on their cell phones and then just throw it up on YouTube if they wanted to.
Like I can take a 4K 120 hertz video feed on my phone right now.
Same thing with books. You can self-publish. And so there's this old world of going through a third party or going through some sort of professional publisher and distributor who basically says, yes, I'm willing to invest in you. And I think your brand aligns with mine. There's somebody that's basically giving them the stamp of approval. But now in any type of area where it becomes extremely accessible, like with creating your own websites or blogs or being able to podcast now or putting a video up on YouTube, suddenly the question is, well, who approves this person because they didn't go through some proper mechanism? Right.
They didn't earn it somehow by going through the normal tribulations, or at least at that point in time, the traditions that were accepted as these are the obstacles you have to overcome in order to meet that threshold.
Yeah.
But that's like This is such a fundamental human dynamic because it happens between the different generations too. Mm-hmm. When we look at like past generations disparaging or like shaming the newer generations for even something as simple as, yeah, back in my day, I had to walk uphill both ways to go to work. It's like somehow that was earned and more hard won than the easier thing that you're doing now. Mm-hmm. And it's the same mentality when you're looking at like all these indie artists and filmographers or producers or whatever don't have to go through the same thing to be able to put their content out there, or you don't have to go through the same struggle to publish your writing or make a podcast. And somehow that means that they're less legitimate. Right. That means that they're not a real writer because, I don't know, they haven't spent decades honing their craft. At some point in that arbitrary length of time, you gain the title of writer. Yeah. In that past perception, which I don't feel like that's all that important to at this point. I used to care about it more. Now I give less fucks about that the older I've been getting.
Yeah, so it's become somewhat democratic, right? Because I think that eventually, instead of a publisher selecting you or some sort of studio, instead you're selected by the people because it's about how many likes you get and how many followers and subscribers you have.
Does it devalue it in public perception when it becomes democratized? Like when anything becomes less rare, it becomes more taken for granted. Meaning it becomes less special, it becomes less elite, it becomes less sought after, whether that's rare people, as in celebrities, and lifestyles that aren't very common, or it's like a rare wine that is very hard to find, and therefore it's super expensive, even though it's not really even though the process isn't really any different from any other wine. It's just, it has this sort of associated name and brand behind it.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely something to that. And ultimately, everybody wants to feel special.
Yeah. And if everybody's a podcaster, nobody's a podcaster anymore.
Right. What doesn't really make sense to me is why people get angry who seemingly, like, okay, for example, that whole writer thing I talked about, that makes total sense because that person feels annoyed by other people thinking they're writers when they haven't gotten an official stamp of approval in the same way.
Did they get an official stamp of approval?
I'm sure. So they're older, and so they went through mechanisms So they've been approved by in other forms, exactly, in the way that it made sense to get approved by being selected as a writer for different forms or getting a job as a writer, versus just writing and putting it out there on the web. Mm-hmm. But I think so that makes more sense to me than when somebody who just every Joe seems to be angry by the fact that there are multiple podcasts out there. For example, when we first started this and I shared what we were doing with somebody who was in the industry, they got pretty upset about there being multiple VR podcasts. And I'm almost like, okay, first of all,
there's like 5, maybe.
If somebody came to me and said they were doing anything, I mean, be a normal human being and congratulate them or encourage them or bring up genuine concerns. Don't just shit all over everything they're doing. Like, what is the fucking point of that?
The first thing you do is just defecate all over their idea.
That's kind of like when you learn who your true friends and supporters are. I'm like, okay, never mind. But why are you so angry about it?
Like, why does that personally offend you so much? Or why do you feel personally obligated to jump on that high horse and shit all over that idea?
Right. And I think it has to do with envy, to your point. I mean, it has to do with just the fact that for some reason it threatens people, and maybe it has something to do with that there is so much pressure today to have a personal brand, to put yourself out there, that just by it existing and by knowing somebody who does something like podcasts or YouTube, it has that invisible pressure on somebody and puts that weight on them that makes them feel like, I'm not doing that. And so I feel threatened. and I'm going to fight that feeling by putting that other person down so I can stay feeling up.
To be fair, there is a lot of just general, and we talked about this, I think, in like one of our last Thoughts on Thoughts. There's like a general widespread expectation or pressure in especially the newer generations that have been very tied into social media to be visible, to project your voice out there, to be on Instagram or Twitter constantly and projecting your thoughts out. And if you don't do that, you kind of feel like you don't exist. And so therefore that generates this sort of complex where you're gonna feel I feel self-conscious all the time whenever I see people online that are constantly doing that constantly project their thoughts out, and I feel like I should do that more. God, I don't do it enough. And then these days I've really just been trying to say like, no, I don't, like maybe that's just not how I am, and not everybody needs to do that. But it's still really hard to overcome that initial instinct of I'm being left out,
right?
Or I'm not visible somehow.
Oh man, I wrote all about this, and it was this article I wrote about being an almost influencer, because I think that
an almost influencer.
I think that we are in the generation in between, which is there was people before us who didn't have this pressure whatsoever, and there's people after us who basically know out of the womb how to manipulate the system or how to navigate it.
They're just used to that constant voyeurism.
Yeah, it's like they're not scared of putting themselves out there. And then there were all these in between people
persons, all of these humanities in between.
These amazing humans who got stuck in between, that were like ridiculed by the older generations for even liking YouTube.
Or being so self-centered.
Right.
Constantly.
But then aren't in that generation of knowing how to use that magic of personal branding to their benefit. And so, anyways, I thought all about that, and how basically I think we need to think about it as if we just decide to be like, oh, that's not for us, that's that younger generation, well, we will kind of fall behind, because that's just how the times are. And if it's the same thing, if you want to stand out, if you want to get a good job, if you want to get ahead, there are certain things that you need to do, which is to call attention to yourself. It's the same thing we do in our typical process of applying for jobs and how we stand out in that process. And that process, it's always been the same. I mean, there are, like, it kind of feels unfair sometimes. You're like, oh man, well, that person, like, they just got this job because they got a lot of likes. But if you think about,
like, somebody found them online because they were more visible, and
right,
that's how
and
they
people
got connected with them.
appreciated that, right? And there's, I mean, in the movie industry, actors who had more quote unquote followers, or people who liked them, got more jobs, even though they weren't necessarily the better person for that job or the better actor. And that idea is stemming from even actors these days are getting picked on who has a better Instagram following instead of just, oh, did they do this scene well in this audition?
Yeah. It's a parallel to what has always been the case for, I mean, as long as the modern sort of professional world has existed, where interviews have been a thing, I guess, since we transitioned from agrarian society into an industrialized, like, factory society, and you had to start being hired for jobs. Anytime you were ever competing against other candidates, the way that, one, you get found is by being visible. And how did you do that before? You would go and, like, meet with the person that owned the company, or run into them in the street and talk to them. Like, you'd have to do more what we would consider organic methods to be visible. And now the new sort of organic medium and means for being visible is by creating a visibility, like a visible profile online.
Right.
Which is the really hard adjustment to make if you didn't grow up in that world.
Totally. And I think that's it. It's that this pressure has always existed. It was just in a different form. And now...
It's like the squeaky wheel gets the oil. It's super straightforward.
How do we call attention to ourselves? So yeah, I mean, we're all just trying to call attention to ourselves.
Right. So, it's the same fundamental struggle.
Which is, I guess, what we're doing here.
It definitely feels a lot more. it can feel more artificial in a lot of ways, just because of the way the medium's kind of evolved. And I think also a lot of that is a side effect of just the sort of advertisement-based internet that we've constructed thus far.
Yeah.
Maybe those things shift over time, but right now we're going through the rough transition period.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. I feel for everyone in our general grouping of peoples,
Like
of the
time
in-betweeners.
proximity.
Yeah, because it is hard. It is a difficult adjustment. And I mean, like this podcast for us, it obviously wasn't easy for us to mentally get over putting ourselves out there. We both had that thought of like, who wants to listen to us? And then we just thought, you know what, whatever. We're just like recording as we learn things in the same way we have normal discussions, and we're just putting mics in front of us to share with other people. And that's how we can mentally accept that we're doing it.
Yeah. Somebody asked me the other day, like, why are you, they were, I guess they'd listened through the recent episode. They're like, why are you all self-conscious about your intros and outros? I mean, they're fine. Like it's,
oh, really?
It's fine. Like there's nothing wrong. Like it's relaxing or whatever. The tone or rhythm of our conversation and whatnot was appealing. And okay, cool. Like, why can't we just get over that? It's been a struggle to get to a point to just
We're so good at calling attention to what we perceive as flaws.
Yeah. It's just
or
like a mutual
apologizing for being here.
I'm sorry.
Hey, this is reality.
I am the way I am.
We should just start our openings with, hey, this is Reality Quest. Sorry
we're doing this. And we don't know why, but thanks for going along with the ride anyways.
Excuse me. Sorry about that. But we're going to go ahead and talk.
Be patient through all of that. You know? And so here's the episode.
Yeah. I mean, I guess to kind of close that out, I would say for anyone who's interested in doing their own form of any of that, and a lot of my friends are like, they're in the same in-between group, the in-between, the almost influencers or the lost souls of almost influencers.
The one slipping through the social cracks.
Yeah. And I think you can obviously do whatever you want. You can build on your branding. You can figure it out as you go. Everyone in the world should do whatever they want. But I don't think that there should be any shame in experimenting with putting yourself out there in the way that the world functions today.
Yeah.
The same way that people started doing cooking blogs online, and it's like, who the fuck gave you the right to share your recipes?
You don't know how to cook? Did you go to a culinary institute? What's your credentials? How did you get where you are? You're not Rachel Ray.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, all right, everyone, calm down, and like anyone can put themselves out there. It does not matter if you get 0 followers or 10 followers. You know what I would love to find is these like amazing blogs that nobody ever followed.
Right.
I mean, there's probably so much stuff like that out there. If you think about poems that are written that never get published or read, it's just like people doing their own thing.
Right.
I mean, this whole idea of like who should be entitled to do whatever, it's like everyone just do whatever you want. And if you want to experiment with something, experiment with it. And if nobody likes it, who cares? Obviously, I'm talking to myself as I say this. Can you tell I'm like talking to myself? Yeah.
Weren't we going to call one of the previous episodes like, do whatever the fuck you want? do whatever the hell you want. Whatever. Maybe that's what this one is.
Yeah.
It's just at the end of the day, do whatever you want.
Right.
Who cares?
I like it. End of episode. Just kidding. That wasn't even the topic. That was me being like, "Hey, this has been on my mind."
This is
Anyways,
just like a recentering.
I guess. Yeah. This is the whole premise of #tots. We can do whatever the fuck we want.
Tots on tots.
Tots on tots.
Tots on tots.
We forgot our intro song. Tots, 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 everybody. And welcome back.
That's amazing. Yeah, welcome back to another episode of Reality Quest.
The second part of this episode is brought to you by Throat Coat Tea
and Woodford Reserve, double oaked bourbon.
Yeah, actually, shout out to Throat Coat Tea. It's like Traditional Medicines does it. If anyone...
yeah, I think it is true. Yeah.
Yeah.
They're pretty nice.
This tea brand, and it's called Throat Coat. If you ever need to be doing recordings, I've heard it works for singers, or if you're speaking in public.
Yeah, you got to talk a lot.
Or if you just have a sore throat, it has some sort of root covering, and it genuinely works. So Throat Coat, check it out.
Yeah.
That's my public service announcement.
This is prep for when we actually have sponsors.
Yeah.
Just like
we're just
getting everybody
yeah.
used to that.
I don't know. I kind of like the idea of never having sponsors because, I hate money. But I love having fake sponsors. Like I would actually be a little bit sad if we got a real sponsor. I like making it up each time.
Yeah. Yeah. Just like Casamigos tequila,
right.
George Clooney's brand.
That was our first one. Mm-hmm. It's great. Anyways. Okay. So today, things I want to talk about. So last episode, we talked with Jude Dye. A wonderful human being. I'm just kidding.
Oh, God.
Okay, so working on my synonyms for amazing and wonderful human beings. Okay, so as part of Jude's episode, we started talking about what is the value proposition of VR or XR in general.
Right. I feel like a lot of that episode kind of circled around the concept of like what makes VR worth caring about for normal people.
Right. And how do you then communicate that and talk with people about it? Because right now, and one of the big topics in that episode was we overuse the term empathy. Mm-hmm. That it's an empathy builder, or that basically I'm going to sell you a headset, and the reason you should have it is that it's going to build empathy for you.
Yeah, it's just going to impart it upon you,
right?
Regardless of where you're at.
And I wanted to dig into all of that a bit more because I do find that all fascinating, and it got me into thinking. First of all, what are the uses of XR and related, okay, so what is the value of each of those categories and how do we talk about that? And I think that
the categories, are you thinking from the perspective of like AR type things or use cases versus VR as like fully immersive type experiences?
No. Okay, so here's how I'm thinking about it. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to talk about XR. And the reason I'm going to try to combine them, my brain will tend towards VR. But I also think that we've talked about this multiple times. The future we're hoping of XR is that they will be merged together in a lot of ways.
I would argue this. I mean, we've talked about this off mic.
Right. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. This is
a worthwhile thing, I think, to clarify at the beginning.
Yeah.
Is that really like if you say VR specifically, I think that term is constantly used by much of the like very enthusiast focused community or the hardcore developers in the industry and people coming from the video game side of things. VR traditionally means something separate from AR or from 360 film, mm-hmm. or room scale like location based experiences. VR is specifically the fully immersive. Like you put on a headset and you're separated from the regular world around you and you have a virtual environment. Some people use VR interchangeably from that meaning to more broadly just mean the whole industry of immersive tech. But I feel like that's confusing, and specifically because so many people that have been around in the industry for a while seem to associate it specifically with like fully immersive experiences. Mm-hmm. I've been pushing for XR in general, or just anything that describes like mixed reality, extended XR, because it's inclusive of everything across that spectrum of immersion, from a very small percentage of just like a little object placed into the real world in mm-hmm. front of you through an AR glasses type interface, all the way across to where your entire room is completely reskinned with different things, to fully immersive. There's nothing from the real world that you're actually seeing. You're in a completely virtual environment and separated. But that whole spectrum encompasses all experiences with immersive tech.
Right. Well, I think you make a good point by, first of all, it seems like most people believe and or want the future to be one where it's really easy to switch between the two. Basically, it could look like some sort of headset where, you can switch the level of translucency or opaque. Yeah. And the reality is, a lot of experiences end up mixing different things. For instance, you could have a 360 video which is like of the real world. It's like regular video or film.
Right. And
then you can overlay that with graphics and interaction. So then what do you call that, right? Because mm-hmm. that then becomes a mix of some sort of virtual reality and 360 video.
Yeah.
And the same thing with augmented reality. I mean, you can see part of the real world, typically all of the real world.
Yeah, the foundation upon which everything else is overlaid or imposed is the real world. That's your environment.
Right.
And you add things to it. Augmented reality, it's additive.
Right.
To the real world.
But if at some point you're adding so much that it's almost like VR, it's like, well, what's the difference? And so to your point, I think that they can overlap a lot. And by if we created boxes and didn't allow those boxes to overlap, that would be a mistake. Mm-hmm. But I also think there is reason for those distinctions. And that's because they have, at least right now, different applications and different uses. Sometimes. Yeah. For instance,
at least thus far have been kind of distinct in how they've been used.
Right. Well, I mean, you could use an example might be, let's say you want to do some form of surgery or surgery training. Like VR might be a great way to do surgery training, but AR might be what you want when you want helpful information, but you need to see the real person and see the body.
Yeah, when you're interacting with the real world in some way.
So anyways, okay, so the categories I'm talking about, generally I'm trying to apply it to all of XR as I talk about this.
This is interesting because you've just described two different dimensions that we need to work with. So this is almost the concept of a semiotic square.
What does that mean?
So if you've ever seen an alignment chart, like a personality alignment chart, or there's this like famous sort of argument about where on the alignment of believing that a certain thing is a sandwich or not a sandwich.
Okay.
So like on one dimension there, like on the x-axis, you have the ingredients perhaps, and then on the y-axis you have the structure. And so if you're like a structural and ingredient purist, you're going to be really far to like the top left of that square, meaning that you believe that a sandwich needs to be two separate pieces of bread and it needs to contain meat or something like that. And then if you're like a structural and ingredient rebel, then you're like like a frozen, deep fried Twinkie or something like that as a sandwich. You're like, I don't even care. I don't even care if the structure is similar. There's like dough fried onto a thing and there's stuff inside. That's a sandwich. So like you could be anywhere across these two different dimensions on that sort of chart. So if we make that analogous to VR or XR, sorry, let me use my own insistent term here.
Please do.
On one part of that spectrum, what you just described is like the level of immersion or the percentage of what you perceive, everything that you are experiencing at any point in time via your senses. You either see at one end 100% of the real world, like natural reality, or you see 100% of virtual reality or virtual representation. And anywhere in between there is somewhere on that one-dimensional spectrum. Or two-dimensional spectrum. But then if you add the vertical, which is the level of immersion, or not immersion, interactivity. So we could impose a second layer there, which is interactivity, whether it's a passive experience or it is a fully individually driven, like you have all of the agency, like in a video game where you are controlling everything you do and all of the ways that you interact with that environment, versus a movie where you are just a passive observer and you're taken along for the ride and you have no agency.
I like this.
Yeah. So it's immersion or level of immersion on one part of the spectrum, and then on the vertical or the y-axis, you've got the amount of interactivity. Anyways,
I like that. Yeah,
we need like an actual visual to really make that worthwhile. I think you should draw
one up and we can publish it.
Sure. So that would be interesting. We'll have to whiteboard this later. But
right. Okay. So totally agree with that. And the way that I've been thinking about separating them right now is, so in terms of categories that we would place on that semiotic square. So one is obviously entertainment.
Right.
Or story.
Or different kinds of entertainment.
Different kinds of entertainment. Okay. Then another one is education. Training would fit into education. So let's just say education /
anything
training.
Where you're trying to impart knowledge or some sort of teaching space.
Thank you. And then no, I genuinely meant thank you.
I wasn't sure if that was a sarcastic. Thank you for clarifying that, Jake.
That was me trying to use different words. I'm really on the whole synonym thing now. So because I always say right, I was trying to think, what else can I say? And I'm like, thank you, but clearly I didn't deliver it very well.
Indubitably.
That is correct. No, genuinely, thank you. That was a good description. Thank you. I don't know why when I sound thank you, it sounds so insincere. Moving on. And the third bucket is information.
So like the information density, like the
I would say information utility might be a better way of describing it.
What does the lightest and most extreme look like?
Well, I don't know if I have that off the top of my head, but an example is if you're overlaying data on the world. Let's say you are at a park and augmented reality gives you information so that you can see what that flower means.
Right.
I understand how that could be mixed with education.
Virtual information is a potential. What is that called? It's another dimension to add into this equation.
I guess for now I'll call it utility, and what I mean by that is that you're using it to accomplish something.
Okay, so it's information with a goal, with a purpose. Like it is information for some reason. It's not because if you're just looking at the world and there's no information other than the structure of the things you're looking at, you're not really being given any sort of, there's no goal with that. As soon as you put some sort of piece of information there, it's like, it's a label for a flower. The purpose is for that label to tell you something about the flower.
I guess.
Maybe.
And now, okay, so what this could obviously feel like education. Yeah. But a difference, so here's maybe a clearer example.
Okay.
When there is an an engineer trying to build something and they're using augmented reality glasses to follow instructions in order to build the thing.
Right.
That's a utility where it's enhanced information over the real world, which is allowing them to do their job. That is different to me than education or training, which is creating fictional scenarios, I'll call it, in order for you to learn a topic or for you to practice something. Now, I think that there's probably a Venn diagram here. Or maybe we just group it under education. I don't know.
I think you could simplify that down to it's all communicating some sort of contextual information. The context being where is that information and what is it relevant to? So, because you're looking at a space. So you're like, either it's a label for something or it's some sort of enhancing pointer or reference.
Oh, like spatial, we'll call it spatial information? Or?
Yeah, it's like it's contextual data or contextual information. And like that is being used in stories as well. Because if you want to emphasize, if you were to imagine that somebody made an augmented reality-based interactive or non-interactive experience of some sort, a story, and they want to communicate a story to the person experiencing this. Mm-hmm. You're at the end of the day, you are communicating additional information or additional data on top of the base reality, the base world that you're imparting those shapes or that information, those voices, the sounds, whatever it is, it's all new info that wasn't there before.
Fair.
Even if it's a story.
Fair. I mean, in the same way that we can say entertainment can be educating and education can be entertaining, so why would we separate those two? But we know that generally they're different purposes, even though there is overlap. And the same thing, I think, whatever we're calling it, spatial or contextual data, that can be educational, but generally the purpose of it is to help you accomplish a specific task in real time, where education is more like prepping your mind or helping open your experience.
So we could think of this as now like three different dimensions. There's the level of immersion over the real world.
Okay.
There is the amount of interactivity or agency that you have an experience. A movie being like the low interactivity side, and then like an interactive video game being the most interactive, the most agency. And then you also have maybe information density. I think you were kind of on I liked that direction when you started that before we tried to break it down further, because that is just how much information are you trying to overlay onto that space, onto that.
You're saying that's the third lens?
That's another lens that could be added. I mean, you add too many and it starts to become overwhelming.
Fair.
So you have to focus on something.
So what I'm talking about, the at least right now I have 4 categories and we've gone through 3. They all fit into, I'll call it purpose or utility.
Okay.
Which is, so we have 1 is entertainment.
Okay.
2 is education. 3 is spatial, contextual, real-time information.
Okay.
Whatever we want to call that category that
Context.
I can't come up with a better label right now.
Yeah.
And then the 4th one that I'm thinking about is connection. So connection could be like social or some form of life experience. Now, interesting question, because obviously like social can be entertaining, but socials, you can have entertainment that's definitely not a social activity. And so there's some sort of connection that I feel like some things would fit in there. There was this recent story about this woman who had her young daughter, who had passed away very sadly and tragically.
Oh, no.
Rebuilt in virtual reality. Did you see this article?
No. Well, I must have missed
So they recreated her, and then the mother could re-meet her daughter. And
really?
Yeah.
That feels very Black Mirror. There was an episode about that.
Yeah. So there's mixed feelings about this. Some people were really touched by it. Some people feel like there's an ethical problem with bringing the dead back to life in VR.
That's interesting, because my immediate thought is that's just kind of the logical extreme, like the logical end of writing a eulogy.
Yeah.
Like what is writing a eulogy about someone who's already passed away? What's the purpose of that? It's to evoke all these memories in the loved ones of that person after they're already gone. And when you're representing them somehow, and doing it in VR just seems like a more apparent and more visually focused version of that.
I suppose I can see it that way.
That's one way to look at it.
But I can also see. First of all, let me start with. I actually haven't decided how I feel about this yet,
Yeah.
and I don't think I want to make any decisions because
that's not me making a decision.
If somebody
That's
wants
just my
to
first
do
thought.
that, right? Then let's say we had the power, the magic in life to bring the dead back to life.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole philosophical question,
Totally.
and doing this in VR is just a version of that philosophical question. Would I want to do that with people in my own life? I don't know. I'd have to figure that out. I don't think so. But I also don't necessarily have a problem if somebody chooses to partake in that type of thing for themselves, because it's not affecting me if they see their dead relative.
Yeah.
But I do think that there is a certain power in this. We've had other conversations about this, which is the power of that, how real VR is, and what you do or decide to not do, and what rules you create due to that power. And because writing a eulogy and hearing and sparking memory based off of some written word is in fact extremely different than seeing a ghost come to life, right?
Was this a ghost?
No, I just mean I meant a ghost by like seeing a dead person is like seeing a ghost.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just
recreating the ghost of someone who has passed.
Right.
And when it's not the actual person.
Right. So
yeah, it's totally different. Just to disclaim that,
Yeah.
I would just that's not. I don't actually feel like that is similar, because there's so many other layers there. But in one way, if you just look at it from the perspective of a representation of a person, there is the eulogy at the one end of that spectrum, and then there's like completely recreating the image of them and the character of them through something like VR.
Right. No, I mean, I think you make a point, which is what are you doing other than bringing back memories of them? Ultimately, it has the same goal. It's just that one is imagined in your head and one becomes realer.
They're all imagined in your head.
Now we're getting real fast.
Well, but that is a fair...
Am I imagining this right now?
No, well, yes. I mean, you haven't... So, like, every person has an entire... Even if I'm not dead, I'm here right now. you have an entire universe perception of me. You have this whole character shaped in your head that is Jay. Mm-hmm. And what you perceive me to be at any point in time. And obviously that's continuing to change because I keep reappearing periodically in your life, in your perception. But after somebody's passed away, then you're only going off of like your reconstructed memory of them and any new information that you find out over time.
Right.
So then you're kind of just recycling your own perception and adjusting it a little bit every time you remember that.
Yeah.
So in that perspective, it's not actually any different. You're still just kind of like re-experiencing them, whether it's a very precise communication to your perception of that person, like in VR, it's literally an image of them versus a description of them in a eulogy.
Yeah.
And you are again seeing them in your mind's eye. Yeah. Just the same, but that one is more personally constructed. The VR one is more information dense as far as a description of them. It's literally the visual. So then...
And I think, I mean, your example of just what, I think ignoring the whole eulogy thing and what's written down, the power of our own memories and what we can reconstruct or in our dreams. Mm-hmm. I mean, I've had many dreams that make me cry waking up to them because it's of somebody I've lost and my whole brain will recreate that person exactly as I remembered them, even though I actually don't really feel like I can do that in the daytime. I don't really feel like I can think of somebody and I can get sad or whatever, but dreams have this whole way of, I don't even know how to remember those mannerisms of somebody.
It's like because there is the separation from when you go unconscious, when you hit deep sleep. And so then when you slide out of unconsciousness into a dream, just like when you're waking up from deep sleep, whatever you're waking up into feels real until otherwise proven to not be real. Like until you've actually woken up fully conscious, your dream feels like you're fully conscious.
Right.
In many cases. Unless there's like super weird things that then you become aware of and you're like, this is weird. Why would this happen?
Yeah.
And then you're like, you're coming out of the dream at that point.
Right.
But that happens to me so often where I am dreaming of things that feel completely normal and not weird, and then I get out of that dream and wake up, and I'm really confused as to what all of that last, I don't know, day of imaginary memories were.
Yeah.
Sometimes those will stick with me for days or weeks. There's some that I remember years later, and that was all a freaking dream. It was all imaginary.
Yeah.
But it's not actually all that different from everything else.
Right. It's just the power of what our minds already do brought into a specific form.
Yeah. So like what is...
Okay, so my point is,
back to the VR
where does that experience fit? I think is a good question. Is it entertain? It feels really weird to call that entertaining. It's not really educational and it's not that real-time contextual information. So I think that fits into something about connection. And I think that connection...
Okay.
So here's a question. Jude had brought up in the past episode the general idea of experiences because she didn't like the term entertainment.
Right.
I don't necessarily agree with her about... I think entertainment can be... It all depends on how you define it. And I do get how she's defining entertainment. But all movies, all movies and books could fall under entertainment. Yeah. I mean, but there are books and movies that have sincerely moved me, challenged me, changed me. So to
much
kind
more
of
extreme degrees.
Degrade that by just saying, "Oh, that falls under an entertainment category." It doesn't feel right. And so, but I still put that under entertainment. Mm. So connection would be obviously social fits under there, but in that scenario where the child is being brought back to life, the mother is connecting with her child. You could also argue that if you do some sort of hike in VR, maybe you're connecting with that. So with
what feels like the natural world, some sort of natural environment.
So we could have one category for connection and put everything in that, or we could have one that is social / connection, and then another one that is we call life experience.
That feels really, really broad.
I know. That's why I don't know what to call it.
What do you mean by that? Is that referring? Which of the things you just
described?
So let's
say you decide that connection is really just social, or something like we could still fit the whole bringing back to life this child in there. But what do you do with experiences that is something like you get to climb Mount Everest in VR?
Right.
Is that entertainment? Is that...
So we need to kind of describe what each of these things, like what kind of experience goes into each of these.
Right.
We use the word experience so much. I've been noticing this for a while now, but it is the sort of encompassing term of anything that you go through and are impacted by, right? So
yeah.
Like at the heart of it, it's literally just you go through it. You
I think
live
it's
through
because
something.
people don't know what to call. If you call... So film and movies have their own term, books have their own term, games have their own term, and VR and AR don't have their own term. So people call it experiences.
Well, because it's more like you lived through something in VR.
Yeah. I mean, film is an experience, a book is an experience. I totally get your point. It's
there's
just
no verb. There's no verb for VRing.
Yeah, there's like experiencing.
Like you don't play VR.
A VR film or playing. You can play VR.
Yeah, sure. Some things you can play in VR.
I think that it's for video games. So
play has become the unanimous term to play a video game.
Yeah. Well, computers. With computers in general, there's verbs for different things that you do, and so I think that with XR platforms, it's the same thing. It depends on, you could play a game in VR. You can watch a movie in VR. But I think ultimately the problem is that all of that pulls from these previous experiences. And the reality is it's so different from those. Watching a movie, so people could even get really picky and think about, watching a movie in VR literally means going into a theater and watching a 2D movie in VR versus watching an immersive movie in VR. So here's the thing. It's okay. We don't have all the language for it yet. That will all techniques and the language around an industry takes so much time to develop.
Yeah.
I was reading related to all of this a lot about the history of the film industry. And I felt like really comforted by that because it's been over a century and we have figured out a lot in that time. There were all these different phases of like what was popular at that time, whether it was like newsreels or musicals or how long the films are. Like they started off as black and white, obviously, like without sound. And then they were only 1 minute long. And then like eventually, decades or so later, they get brought into, they're like 60 minutes long, right? And so the point is, I know that there's a history of VR. Like everyone gets upset when they say it's new because they're like, it got started in the 80s. I'm like, all right, calm the fuck down. Okay. That's like saying that movies got started with like projectors. It's like, yes, you can go back to like the 1800s, like the mid 1800s. You could make arguments that movies got started with archaic storytelling. Like, do whatever you want in this argument.
We could take this all the way back to like literally movies got started with plays, and plays got started with written stories, and written stories got started with cave paintings.
It's all connected, but the point is there are phases in which things grow bigger and bigger, and then it gets adopted more by the masses. And so I'm referring to the now, which is when XR is starting to get actually adopted by consumers. I'm not referring to all the past, but even if we do include all of the past, I mean, you can go back like when we talk to Tom Furness and you can say whatever it started back then. But really, I think like the beginning is more, it's closer to now. Like the past will be all of that context in the background of that build up to something. But the start of adoption is really in this century.
Right.
And so given that, we have a lot of time. If film took so long, or even I guess like computers went and like the web went a bit faster, but we still have a lot of time that would be expected to develop the terminology, the lexicon, whatever it is, to help us talk through these things. So I'm okay that we're calling things experiences, but I do like part of us talking through all of this right now is to try to help figure that out with each other and with everyone else, is how do we talk about these things in a way that is helpful. And that's not like, hey, here's an empathy machine. You can experience stuff through
empathy machine.
Yeah.
That's so
VR,
funny now that I
experience.
Say that back.
Oh, no, you're fine.
Yeah.
No, that's like what all of us talk about it that way.
Right.
And it's like the big thing. And I feel like there should just be this tagline of just like, have experiences, have empathetic experiences in VR. It's like, what? How is that a selling point? Like, who even... like, no, thank you. If somebody sold me a movie by saying that I would feel very empathetic watching it, I'd be like, no fucking shit, dude. Isn't that the whole point of movies? Like
maybe
we are empathetic human beings who want to live vicariously through the character.
So this is an interesting problem with saying that VR is empathetic. It's like saying that Canvas is empathetic, or creates empathy. So more people should paint because painting creates empathy. Or like the canvas itself is what creates empathy. VR is a canvas for all of these potential ways to tell stories or to put people through things or to play games in VR that are just more immersive. But it's a medium in itself. And so saying that it's empathetic is... It doesn't actually mean anything.
Yeah.
The empathy is actually based on the content that is the information that is being communicated to and the person that is receiving that info. Because there's no empathy if the person can't relate to the info that's being communicated to them.
Right. I get that.
So like the audience matters as well as just as much as the medium.
Right. And I get that empathy generally means being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, but actually empathy often means that you can literally, like, you've already experienced something and you can be empathetic towards someone where you like really feel for them. You can empathize with them.
Right.
And so I just think that's the wrong word. The word that I like is actually perspective, because and by the way, all mediums can do this. So if you read a good...
conversation can do this.
Yeah, a conversation can do this. If you read a good book, it will give you perspective on the world or perspective on a character's emotions that you may not have had before, or that just gives you a certain truth that maybe you already knew or maybe you just saw it from a different angle.
The only common thing between all of those different mediums is you putting the mental energy in to actually imagine yourself in that position.
Mm-hmm.
So like whether that is through reading or talking to somebody, it's like reading a whole book or having a bunch of conversations with people enough that you can start to imagine yourself in those shoes, or watching a really evocative movie, or going through a VR experience, whatever it is. If it gets you to the point where you start being able to do the mental backflips to put yourself in an imagined circumstance, then you start to feel empathetic.
Mm-hmm.
But none of those things in particular just creates empathy.
Right.
It's that you are able to build up enough context and break down enough of your own cognitive dissonance with the differences in what you've experienced from that you can actually start to create that reality in your own imagination.
It's the connection between the human who is experiencing it along with how that story or that experience is being told or presented to them.
Yeah. And not to devalue that. That's not to say that someone who's never been through a particular experience can experience what that's like just by building up enough context, but not actually going through the thing itself. Like, there is obviously something to be said for literally going through the same experience, literally walking in somebody else's shoes. But if you want to talk about generating empathy in general, it's like, it doesn't matter what medium you're using. They're like different ways or conduits to a person's imagination. Mm-hmm. That's how I'm like thinking about this now after all these different conversations. Yeah. It's like what is the best way to get to that person's imagination, their imaginative power to recreate a new perspective.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, if we say then that first, that if it depends on the person and any type of medium can make someone empathetic or give perspective, well, then we're kind of like, okay, so then what is the differentiator, the value proposition of XR? And I also feel like my brain is exploding because I just want to talk about too many things. But one of those two is, I think I'm so on the same page about this whole imagination thing, and that it has something to do with how it taps into our imagination.
This is why we need guests, because we need people to disagree so that we can pick apart these things even further.
I think you're wrong, Jay. Does that make you happy? Well, so I feel like it totally has to do with imagination and what... I think, okay, I want to go back to the structure because the problem is I start going too all over the place.
Right. We're getting too far away from that original goal.
Right. So let's step by step get to where we want to get. So the first thing was trying to define what are the categories, and then we can go by each category to say what is the value of that category. So where we were at was that we have...
we had levels of the amount of immersion.
We have at your
entertainment versus education versus
right. Okay. So I want to talk about those lenses that you're talking about, but they're gonna add on to later because I need to be clear on what categories, because that's not
the categories you're talking about are around what is the purpose of the content.
Right. And that's what I'm trying to get at, which is because we're about to talk about the value proposition. So there's a difference between the value proposition of the content versus, how does that change when you add the lens of interaction or not?
Oh, yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Okay. This is a clear separation. Awesome. This is really good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
You just planted...
That was a genuine thank you. I felt that.
It really was.
I need to work on that.
Yeah. So now we have separately... the medium itself, if you want to describe the advantages or the powers of this canvas of XR, or initially we were talking about the amount of immersion, the amount of interactivity, and maybe the amount of information being communicated at any point in time. And then totally separate from that, that's all just about the canvas itself, XR as a tool for communicating anything. We're talking about categories now. Categories is... what is the purpose of the content and the message and the information?
Yes, that's what I'm trying to get at. And then we go by each one to say, what is the value that purpose or category brings us?
Because at the end of oh my gosh, at the end of the day...
You're just really excited.
Trying to say too many things at once.
Skip to the point.
The whole purpose of content... Well, the whole purpose of content is... to accomplish something. You're trying to reach somebody by communicating things. So what are you doing?
Right. And this all relates again back to what came up in the last episode with Jude, which is, what problem is VR or XR solving? And that just really got me thinking. Yeah, so given that, that's how I want to go about this. So the first thing we need to do is align on those categories to make sure we're generally not missing anything. So we have entertainment, we have education, we have contextual data, we have...
What is contextual data? Where does that...
Oh my God, Jay, we just talked about it.
No. But
I can't discuss this any further.
but that's... It seems to not fit. You said education. You said entertainment.
Yeah.
And then you said contextual data.
Yes, that's a third. Oh my God, I feel like we need a whiteboard because...
No. I know what you mean for that, but I think the term is...
I already said I don't know what to fucking call this term, Jay.
Well, to remind myself on that, contextual data
you called it contextual, so I was trying to make you happy. It's like spatial information. I wrote information.
It's for a job.
In real time. Spatial information or utility.
It's utility-focused info.
Oh, God. We'll come up with a better name.
Whatever.
But can we just call it, call it whatever you want to call it?
Sure, it's okay.
Stop bothering me about it.
Okay, fine. So you said entertainment, education, something that has utility, like for a job.
Yes.
Like somebody's working on a power line.
Yes. Okay. In real time, let's call it. Because obviously education can help with jobs.
But, it could also be CAD. They could also be creating models in full immersion.
Exactly.
Whatever. Yeah. Either way.
Oh, good point. So VR fits in that one. Thank you. Because I was thinking, is that just AR? Okay. And then the last one I have was connection.
Okay.
So which could mean social or which could mean connection with something else like mountains or connection with the world, like experiencing something, feeling something.
Yeah.
Now, like I said, we could separate something out into life experience. Yeah. So but maybe let's leave it as is. Okay. And then if we want to break it down further as we get there or as we learn more, we can I think what we should do is after we re-listen to this, we'll create a diagram. and label some stuff and then keep revising that as we have these conversations.
Building a model.
Yes. Oh my God, Jay, are you so excited?
We're building a model.
You model lover, you.
So just to make a comment on that particular thing,
yeah,
I do. Maybe we can keep those all in one category for now, because I'm going to look at this as humans anthropomorphize everything. So like any time that somebody feels like they really connect with nature, or they go out into the mountains and they feel like they connect with the natural environment, or you feel like you go to a concert and you connect with all these other people there, or the artist on the stage, or you have a deep conversation like between you and I and we really connect on something, or I really connect with my pet rock as a kid, whatever. Like you are projecting some sort of agency and personality, some sort of sentience to that thing that you can connect with.
Ooh.
So it's like any experience or setting where you feel connected to something else.
Yeah, I like it.
Okay.
And
so that's a whole
again,
category.
right. Again, obviously that can happen through entertainment and education.
Right.
But like we're trying
to
to do our best to cleanly separate, knowing that there's a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
And we'll keep revising this and working on it, but it's going to help us talk through some stuff. And then as we learn through our conversations, or if we get feedback based on people listening to this and having their opinions, great. Cool. We can take another look at it.
Yeah.
Okay, so those 4 categories, do you think I'm missing anything?
What I would try to think of is what doesn't fit into those. Can I think of any examples that fall outside of education, entertainment, connection, and utility? I can't right now.
Okay, great.
We'll keep thinking.
Let's move on. So then the question is, okay, what is the value, or what problem does that category solve?
For each of those.
For each of those. Now, I think that we can get one out of the way, which is utility. Like, come on.
Right.
I feel like that's a boring one to talk about.
Right.
It's just like, it helps you accomplish a task, literally.
You could say it's goal-oriented, but it's only goal-oriented in that it's literally like, it's focused on some sort of societally considered productivity. It's like you're doing a job, you have a clear goal in mind. I want to build a model of this building, this architectural rendering. I'm going to work in VR or partial VR for the next few hours and kind of move stuff around in this space, or build a model or whatever. Or you're working on a real life power line and you've got contextual information popping up around what you're doing, like showing you the voltage in the line at the moment, or like what kind of line that is and what kind of tool you should use for it. Or it's a surgery. And it's like literally identifying different parts in the body as you're working. Yeah. That's all utility.
Right.
Perhaps.
Which it helps you accomplish a task. That is the problem it's solving is, it's really improving the way in which and the speed in which we can accomplish tasks.
It's also I feel like something like Google Maps augmented is like that, because you're literally trying to find a good restaurant in town and you tell it, hey, what restaurants are nearby that are really good? And it pops up a bunch of different labels on the sides of the buildings around you for like, oh, this one's got like this many reviews, blah, 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 cool. It's Vietnamese food, whatever.
Yeah.
And like that is also utility because there's a goal in mind.
Right.
Or at least that all of these things have a goal, but like this is a productivity type goal.
Yes.
Okay.
I'm with you. Okay. So I feel like let's ignore that one.
Okay.
Because we basically, we feel good about, that's actually probably the reason that businesses can argue. So I would say that, and then also the education training group, those feel like they're being sold pretty well.
Meaning, it's easier to communicate the benefit or the value prop.
Exactly. And like corporations are bringing them into training. It's like these feel like the two where people can talk about that in a easier, and people are already using it in the way that they're supposed to be used. Yeah. And people can understand their value. Okay. So then we have the two that are the weird ones, which is entertainment and connection.
Yeah.
So I guess let's talk about, I don't know, which one do you want to talk about first?
Let's talk about connection first.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah.
That's very thematic with Jude's episode.
Totally.
She's a total connection kind of
like
person.
Both of those are actually really thematic with her episode because we also started to dig into entertainment.
Yeah.
And I would like to.
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll get there.
Oh, for sure. That's the one I care most about. Yeah.
So connection, to jump back to that, my thought right now is that connection is literally any time that you feel connected to something external.
Okay.
Whether that is a person or it is the
external,
nature.
you mean
from yourself?
From yourself.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you can feel really aligned or like centered with yourself.
Oh, well, meditation. Let's talk about, does that fit
Sure.
into this category?
I
think so. It's connection with the self.
Yeah, I do think so.
Oh my
Because
God,
you perceive yourself as separate.
Exercise.
Yeah.
We forgot exercise.
Would that... I don't want to have a whole debate on like trying to categorize every single kind of activity, but would exercise fit into... It's not a training thing. Yeah,
you can
I guess
mix
health.
it into entertainment. Oh, nice. Exercise and health. And we can also ignore that one because the value is also pretty clear, which is like if you can get great exercise in VR and be distracted, or it can improve your health in some way.
Yeah.
Great. Now, I think meditation would be in the middle of that kind of Venn diagram situation or that overlap, because it could give you connection with yourself. It could also be healthy. But I do think that is its own category, and we get the benefit of that. So we can ignore it, but I'm adding it to the list.
I might want to make an argument on that later.
Okay,
right now, I'm
We're
fine with it.
We're entitled to change all of our opinions on this.
Totally.
We can do whatever the fuck we want, Jay. That's the theme of this episode.
Yeah, these are all in theory. What is the saying goes that like all models are wrong, some are useful.
Oh. I didn't know that was a saying.
Yeah. I can't remember the guy that actually came up with that. He was a statistician.
I
think
love that. It's like clicking for me right now.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh,
like
that's a great saying.
Anytime the whole concept of a model is like a simplified. That's the erroneous word. A simplified view of something, and the reality is always complex.
Of course,
intractable. But we have to.
We're trying to get something to be helpful.
Yeah. We want something useful,
right? Which is there's always that person that picks apart everything to death, and that person is not helpful. Don't be that guy.
Don't be that.
Let us get somewhere before we pick things apart. Okay, so back to connection. Okay, so you're talking about how it's connection with something external, or potentially, I think connection...
we perceive everything as external, even ourself. Like, you think of yourself as an external entity, almost.
Oh man, my brain just blew up. Who am I?
Well, there's like, I think you have to, right? Like the whole point, everything our consciousness is built on is externalizing things.
We're just avatars.
Yeah, like because like there's the you that is in the moment right now thinking about themselves. But as soon as you say that, yourself is a separate thing. You have to step outside of that center and think about it. So that's either you, like exploring your own consciousness. That's where you start to blur the line because you're just letting subconscious thoughts kind of bubble up as you meditate, maybe, if that's your goal.
Yeah.
Or you are just trying to feel connected with the dirt and trees and things around you out in nature, or you're trying to feel connected in a conversation with another human.
Yeah.
Or animal, whatever.
I love it. Okay, so then what's the benefit of connection? What problem does connection solve? It solves loneliness. Right? It solves
like the value proposition of feeling connected with anything.
I think that if I try to answer this in short, it solves it gives.
Well, I don't want to reuse the word utility, but the utility of it, the novelty of it, is because we as humans need connection, even with ourselves or other things around us. Like we have to feel connected to something in some capacity. Otherwise, we're just kind of like lost in the void.
So there's this person I was reading about who has they define, again, this is like a model that I'm sure is wrong but helpful.
Sure.
Which they say there are these 3 main psychological needs, and one is competence, control or mastery. One is autonomy, which is control over actions. Like the opposite would be manipulation.
Sure.
And then the third is relatedness, which I think is what we're talking about, which is we need to feel like we matter to others.
Or like we fit into
yes.
some sort of context. That's why we constantly feel anxiety when we feel like we don't fit.
I think it's a feeling of belonging. I like that word because then it encapsulates connection with the earth as well as with human beings, because you need to feel like you matter. But there are times where, like, if you're out in nature and you actually feel small and that's a good feeling, that doesn't make you feel like you matter. It just...
It doesn't? Well, you say matter, and I think you're talking about like feeling like you're contributing somehow, or like the things that you do make a difference.
Yeah.
To anybody else.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I would say that. I don't necessarily think that that like standing out in nature makes you feel part of this huge thing, this massive, overwhelmingly large system, place, presence, just being in that space, and you're a part of it. I mean, this is all subjective. Like, you could perceive it that way. You could also perceive it as, I don't matter because I'm so small. There's lyrics by this band called Mimicking Birds that I really like, and there's like 1 in 6 billion people. How could they make a difference at all, or something like that? I swear, it's like, I swear it's not me. I'm too small. How can that affect anything at all? I am 1 in 6 billion. I can't be at fault. How could that affect anything at all?
Ooh.
Yeah. So it's like you could feel that way, overwhelmingly insignificant. You could also look at that as overwhelmingly connected to everything. I feel like those are just kind of like a like pessimism
part of
versus
something
optimism.
Bigger.
Yeah.
I can see that. Yeah.
I think that's like that seems to fit on like a pessimistic versus an optimistic sort of spectrum view of reality, which everybody has their own natural lean there.
Okay, so...
But we're getting kind of esoteric away from...
Okay, well, I think that we could talk about that, how we define that and how forever. But you can find that in real life.
Yeah.
And so what is VR or XR doing for us when it provides that? If we can find that in real life.
Connection. That when it provides us that connection.
Yes.
What is
what is it solving?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like we already.
I guess we said loneliness, the need to feel like a part of something, to belong to something, to be part of something greater.
Feeling connected makes it feel like you matter in some capacity at all.
Yeah,
feeling connection feels like you matter. Which
we've seen already by our discussions with social VR, that this is an obvious solution, because there are plenty of people who, for various reasons, have trouble connecting in the real world, or maybe they don't get enough connection, or they're prevented from connecting. Whatever that reason is, they find those connections.
It's a new means for doing that.
Yes.
For connecting.
Yes. And so I want to, before we move on to a different category, one thing I want to drive into here is I was having, because I can't go any episode without mentioning my mom. This is it's the challenge of the year. How can I integrate her? And she had listened to Evie's episode 3, which I was like, oh my God, if she's already like... She basically had this opinion of like, oh, I'm scared by all of this technology. And I thought, oh my God, if she's scared by Evie's episode, please don't listen to Mike's.
Don't go any further. Yeah. Stop there.
Stop. You know what?
Run away now.
We're not doing the podcast anymore. You know?
Don't even listen.
Yeah,
nothing happens.
Lie to her. Yeah.
We're done.
But I also, she had a funny anecdote.
So much worse.
Yeah. She had a hilarious anecdote there, which is she said, oh, well, it's all I just prefer the real world. And she goes, but, I'm just old, and I did cry when your father used the microwave to warm up tea instead of using the tea kettle, which just like encapsulates that to me is a hilarious. By the way, they're divorced but good friends now.
Okay, so
and
they
it's
can
just
laugh about
like
it.
I laugh so much about it because that just encapsulates so much about their relationship to me. It's like my dad trying to just microwave some hot water and my mom crying. Okay. I'm like, oh, what a wonder that you guys didn't work out. Okay. So, I mean, she had this connection with her. It's very fascinating to me. So she would watch she had a very close relationship with her great grandmother, and her great grandmother was Scottish, and she would always heat up tea and serve tea in this old fashioned tea kettle. And so that to her was more than just heating up tea. I think that there's this feeling of, yes, there's stuff where we're scared about microwaves and what they can do, and we're often scared. Like something always feels inauthentic, or maybe or unnatural when we add new mechanisms of doing something. Like
you add a new layer to it somehow, which is the tea kettle, or in this instance, it's the microwave.
Yeah, I mean,
devalues it somehow.
So I think that there's always a couple of reasons people struggle with certain technological advancements.
Yeah.
Let's take the microwave for existence. For existence.
For example. Let's take the microwave for it exists.
That whiskey's starting to get to me.
Uh-oh.
So the microwave obviously is amazing in many ways in how it can quickly heat things up. But then there's all this talk about cancer and yada yada and what it could potentially be causing. And there's like this old-fashioned sense of don't use a microwave. My sister doesn't use a microwave, and I live that way for a little bit. It drives me crazy because I like my coffee really hot. Now I'm just on a whole different topic.
This is just turned into a crazy tangent.
So anyways,
we're like excusing microwaving coffee.
So anyways, this is how I like my coffee.
Oh God, okay, I'm shaking my head at this.
Okay, so all right, so microwaves give us a lot of benefit. There are some genuine health scares that people have.
Genuine in that it's not unreasonable to be scared of new technologies, just on principle that it's something new and you don't know what the effect is.
Well, yes, and I think there's literally, now this is something I need to look up, but I believe there's actual stuff about like microwaves causing radiation or something like that. There's something about microwaves.
Microwave radiation is a thing.
Yeah.
But the way that they're built is not like no significant amount of radiation actually escapes the Faraday cage of the microwave.
Yeah.
It's literally a metal mesh that is built inside of that container that is the holes are the right size that it blocks out any of that microwave wavelength.
Okay.
Of energy. So it doesn't get to escape that box, and it turns off immediately and dissipates when you open the door. It's instant. So there's maybe there's trace amounts of microwave radiation, but it's not significant compared to the overall ambient environmental energy. So like,
fine. I'll believe you because I don't know enough to contradict you. But okay, so riddle me this: why? Why? Starts to be that giggly portion of the night. Okay, so why do you use a hot water tea kettle instead of the microwave for tea?
I think me personally, I've got nostalgia with a tea kettle.
Yeah. Okay. So, oh my God.
But I prefer an actual I would prefer a tea kettle over a fireplace to even a stovetop tea kettle. But it's not something that I can do, and
because stovetop tea kettles take so long.
There's just something. No, like it would take even longer to put a tea kettle over a fire and boil water.
But you prefer that.
I mean, if I could do that, I would do that.
You do love fire.
There's there's something like a good Yule log in a fireplace in your warm, cozy cabin in the middle of wintertime. There is a nostalgia with visions of the past, and it feels like a very it feels like a very olden, like simpler times perception of when you could go and put the kettle over the mantle at your fireplace and boil your water that way.
Okay, so you're literally defending my mom's position right now.
I'm not. I am.
Maybe defending is.
I am partially. I am saying that it's not unreasonable to feel that way in general. what I personally do feel is unreasonable is when you are confronted with information that shows that there's not that deconstructs some part of your rationale for why you don't do that thing, that you ignore it and you say, well, I don't like it.
Okay, totally agree. Yeah. So there's a difference between having a knowledgeable preference, knowing that maybe it's a bit silly and nostalgic, or just nostalgic, versus and accepting the fact that, like, yep, the microwave's no problem, tea kettle, the electric tea kettle, no problem. I just happen to have this preference because I'm old school.
Yeah, I don't think there's not like actually any difference or discernible difference in like microwaved hot water versus boiled, like stovetop or electric kettle.
I know some
water,
people who have very strong opinions about that.
I know.
They're like disgusted by hot water being heated up in the microwave. That being
coffee,
said,
though, once you start introducing other materials into there, like oils from coffee, you could be breaking them down very differently. Like cooking an egg in the microwave versus on a stovetop is very different.
All right, well,
it's more complicated.
Have a whole episode about microwaves. I don't even know. Should we just talk about microwaves for the rest of it? I don't even know what we were talking about. No, I think that
microwave whatever you want. That's actually the name of this episode.
Yeah. So, all right. So what I was going to bring up with regards to that category of connection is that my mom basically had this opinion of, I just prefer real life, and she is scared by all this technology. Yeah. But what we're talking about in this category is how much is basically like what you get in real life. We're talking about social connection. Yeah. So I want to bring up, we had talked about that the journey of consciousness, or we were just talking about it on a different Thoughts on Thoughts.
The journey of consciousness.
Conscious existence, that experience in VR. You were talking about how you showed it to your family.
The 360 experience. Yeah. Right.
So
it's on that spectrum of interactivity, it is passive, meaning that you can't do anything to the environment around you. You're just kind of along for the ride.
Yes. Now, when I experienced that, it was so beautiful, and I have a specific image in my head. It takes you through a lot of different things, like you had mentioned, maybe a kind of womb-like feeling.
It feels like you're in a womb.
Space feeling.
Yeah, you're in nebulas.
Right, but one of them is you're going over this, like, these green grasses, and you have these trees around you.
Yeah.
And I remember this feeling
rays of light kind of going through the branches.
Yeah. And I remember that feeling of that awestruck beauty and wanting to reach out and just kind of touch the leaves of the trees.
Drag your fingers through the tall grass.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that has that effect, that connection experience for me. So that experience would fall somewhere in between the entertainment and the connection category, because it really did have this weird meditative connection feeling with the world.
So what it sounds like you're describing, and what we experience in that kind of situation, is that feeling of connection is actually just feeling very innately tied to or connected to, like, a part of the space that you're in. And that could be people around you, and that could be the middle of the mountains and gazing out at the horizon and valleys splaying out before you, but somehow you feel part of this thing that is bigger than yourself.
Yeah.
Your self center.
Well, so yeah, and drugs can do this.
Totally.
So
or at least they blur the normal edges of your sensory.
Right, and so certain drugs are known to give you that type of connection experience. Things like,
like DMT or
DMT. Something? That's actually the exact example. For anyone who doesn't know what DMT is, it's a drug that is supposedly a chemical that's released when you're born and when you die.
Oh,
and it sounds like you should just look it up. It's a really bizarre experience. I've never done it, but I've heard that it's a really bizarre experience, but that generally a lot of people have similar experiences with it, and that it causes a feeling. I think it's pretty inexplicable, but we'll call it connection of some sort, like some different perspective on the world and their connection to that world.
It's like, when you're in that moment where you're passing through these pastures and fields and a forest, and there are tree branches undulating above you and rays of light shining down your face, and you start to feel that warmth and want to reach out and run your fingers through the grass and the tree branches.
Yeah.
It's like your edges are blurring.
Yeah.
The edges of what you perceive as yourself are blurring. It's like what happens sometimes in a meditative state, or maybe under certain chemicals like DMT. It blurs the lines where you normally say, this is where I end and everything else begins.
Yeah.
This is the edge.
Yeah, which feels like, I think there are certain things that are innate in people or animals.
Yeah.
For instance, my cats do that thing where they eat and they do that scratchy thing where they're like burying their food. Well, yeah, that too, the kneading.
Oh, right.
But that's more like learned from taking
childhood
milk from the mother. But I'm talking about when they like try to, they scratch the ground because they're trying to basically store their food for later. But if people have cats that have only ever lived in homes that have been domesticated that do this, they never needed to save their food for later, and they're scratching at a wooden floor or a tile floor. There's nothing that they're burying or storing. Nevertheless, they do this activity.
Yeah.
And I think there are things in all animals that are like that, this innate understanding.
Those are our instincts that are...
Right.
Yeah.
And for us, there is something about like touch, or the fact that, to your point about how certain lines get blurred, it's like, oh, you just reach out, like you don't even know, you just kind of reach out and want to feel that thing and explore it. Yeah, without even thinking about it. And that was a big thing for me where, okay, this is something in VR that's very different. I don't do that when I'm reading a book, and I don't do that when I'm watching a movie. But I got this feeling of like, oh, I just want to do exactly what I might want to do in real life. Mm-hmm. But I'm in a safe space and an imaginary place where I'm floating and in this beautiful world that is like made up for me. But and I can reach out and maybe touch this tree if I want to. Now, in this experience, they didn't have interaction, so nothing was going to happen if I reach out.
The environment won't respond to you. It's still passive,
right? Which is fine. I mean, that's a whole other conversation. Yeah. But the point is, like, okay, so what does that really do for us? Why do something like that in VR, and how can you sell that to somebody like my mom? So for me, I think it has something to do with that safe space, that it's not that, yes, I get it that when you put on a headset or when you're looking at your phone or when you're looking at your computer, you're in a virtual space and you're not in the real world. But if you can accomplish the same things, then the question becomes, so why do that in VR versus go out and touch a tree outside?
Right. Because you can't necessarily go out and touch the tree.
But I mean, okay, let's talk about you and I. We literally can go outside and touch a tree. So why do that?
I can, but maybe I also can't because of time constraints, because I've been really busy with things lately, or maybe I can't actually go to China and experience the Great Wall, or maybe I can't actually meet with my friend Forrest because he's on the other side of the country. Maybe I can't actually see my family. Maybe I can't experience this historical setting that I really connect with because it doesn't exist anymore. Or maybe it's a story or a place that I really relate to, but is totally imaginary. It's just, they're things that you kind of like consciously want to connect with at some level, but you don't have to be physically handicapped in order to be limited from the things that you desire to connect with or the connections that you desire to make.
Yeah.
Like we all have that as a deficiency. We all have a deficiency of a connectedness.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think that's totally fair. And that's almost like the easy answer, which is like, of course, if you can't connect with somebody, like, I'd love to connect with my sister in Spice Girl Tea Party coming soon. Obviously, in person. And I know Charlie's going to give me shit for this. Hey, Charlie.
We do need to talk about this.
But like, yes, in person is almost always better. Like, I don't.
We should talk about the difference.
God, it's like, so this is hard because I think all of these things can exist at once. So let's say, I don't know if this is a great example, but I'm going to go with it. Do you want to experience a story through a book or go out in the world and experience life? Well, like, both have a place in my heart. I love going and living a story, but I also love experiencing that story through the lens of somebody else and having this fiction thing happen to me.
Right.
And they both have a place. Now, when we're talking about human connection, I do think that because there are so many, because we read off of people's body language and all these nuanced tiny things with their faces and what they're doing when they're talking, it's the easiest form of connection for somebody like me. But there's a lot of people who actually prefer being hidden a little bit, and they feel like they can open up a little bit more that way.
Maybe they have social anxiety in some capacity, and so being face to face with people is problematic because you're overwhelmed with the feeling of being vulnerable or something in that state.
Yeah.
And so it's uncomfortable for whatever set of reasons. This environment where you have that veil feels more safe and secure and feels like you're more capable of connecting.
Yeah. And now to give context, by the way.
We need to like...
My friend Charlie, who I love, and he's a great fan of the show, was basically giving a shit for saying, like, we'd prefer in-person recordings when we're talking about VR all the time.
Right.
Now, and to be fair, like, he was very nice about it and was totally understanding. And that is a totally fair thing to laugh at us for. But
it's a VR podcast. And we're literally saying...
We're like, we want to talk in person.
VR is inferior in this capacity right now.
Right, but
in some
I think that everything has a place, and also VR will get better and better where things like avatars will be able to show those expressions.
Yeah.
Or it'll kind of stay like, cell phones. I seem to be happy. I seem to almost prefer using emojis to state my emotions.
I totally do.
Yeah, so it could go either way. But
there's limits of the medium.
Yeah, and I think that it depends on what you want to do. I tend to like, when I'm getting to know someone, meeting with them in person, reading their body language. I talked about this in a different episode. I feel kind of like robbed of all of that, which is why I struggle with social VR. That being said, social VR will introduce me to people that I wouldn't otherwise meet. Or even with, like, we did a thing recently where we played half and half and we got to play hide and seek.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh my God. Well,
so fun.
I see the people I play that with, we see, like, all the time. And yet I don't get to play hide and seek as, like, a miniature person and a really giant person.
Yeah.
In this game. Can't remember if we talked about this game before, but, like, we'll link it in the show notes. But
Half
it's an amazing game. So, okay, so basically, there's different reasons to do one or the other, and I think you can get a benefit out of any of them. But,
I think there's a useful exercise to go through here.
Okay.
So we should think about starting earlier on. What are the limits of what can be communicated through, and in what ways, through each medium as it's evolved over time. I mean, we started out with nobody had thought to put something, like to paint something, to draw a thing. So we were just talking, which is the base way that humans have interacted, right?
Wait, this is actually, I don't know, this is a dumb question. Do you know for sure that people used language before they used pictures?
Maybe we used some form of sign language before we had, like, verbal language. I guess that's possible, but we, in some capacity, whether it was auditory or it was visual with, like, hands and whatnot, we had to be communicating with one another.
Yeah.
And imagine, the common imagination of that is that we were, like, using grunts and stuff, and that slowly formed into actual language.
Yeah,
or actual language.
Or, like, I guess I'm thinking of cave art. And so I'm like, okay, well, what was used like that versus trying to sign language versus actually trying to have a spoken language?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Like, did we have the ability to recreate something we saw via cave art before or after we developed language?
Yeah.
So, oh God, I don't know.
I'm trying to like very quickly look this up. I'm like, what came first?
That's a really interesting question.
Of course, the first thing is language or thought. That's a whole language theory, which I love.
Which that's gonna like get into like Noam Chomsky and all that about just theory.
We don't need to go there.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's getting too deep into that right now. But that is an interesting question.
Ooh, there's an article on Nat Geo that says ancient cave drawings and early human language linked in new study. So we don't know, and we don't need to get into it. But let's move on without digging in there, and we'll link some stuff in the show notes. So okay, go on.
So the earliest things that we can look at, though, are recorded of like an external representation. Maybe before cave art, maybe you could describe something having happened or describe a scene to a person. So like, let's just assume that happened. And then you, maybe around the same time or simultaneously, we started to develop ability. Say like, we could describe that thing. I can also like draw it. I can take some clay and paint on this wall. I can represent it in 2 dimensions. And so that started to evolve, and we gained the ability to think about perspective in 2 dimensions. And then we went through all these different evolutions of refining our ability to paint and portray scenes, 3-dimensional scenes, but in 2D. And then eventually we started writing books. So we refined language more, where we could actually like write down a story over time. But it's probably that we always thought about things as stories, as a progression of events. So like what I want to get down to, the question that I want to ask you to is like, what are the limits of a 2D representation and what you can communicate there? And then what are the limits of a book, a written sort of story? And then a movie or like television, essentially, like a framed 2D sort of story portrayed. And then we move to interactive mediums like video games and then like VR, where essentially at this point the big difference is that the frame is gone. You are put into it. So like we can kind of set that aside. Let's start with things like books or written language, and then pictures, 2-dimensional pictures that are limited somehow in their scope.
Right. So I think books are all about describing, and literally, I mean, we know from literature how in depth they would go about certain descriptions. Like there was a table. That table was mahogany. There was a lock on it. That
just like painting a scene.
Exactly. It's describing it so that it's guiding your imagination into this world, so you can escape into that world and know exactly what that person was trying to get across.
Yeah. Like each of those words creates a concept, and you kind of implant those concepts into a perceived space.
Right. I think it might be in an upcoming episode, but at some point we talked about how some VR experiences they'll show what images can look like as you're imagining them. Meaning the example that's used is something like on Notes on Blindness, which is an experience. It's showing what this blind person is imagining based on what they hear.
Right.
And so that's how I envision what books are doing for us.
Yeah.
It's describing something and then in great detail so that we can imagine it.
Yeah.
But we have a lot of space to fill in for ourselves. Everyone is imagining something a little bit different. In fact, it's always fascinating to talk with people about something like, how did they imagine a character or a place looked in Harry Potter, or what butterbeer tasted like.
Oh, gosh.
And that's why it's so funny, because I think that movies that are adaptations or theme parks like Harry Potter World are trying to bring that all to life in the way that was described in the book and what the author thinks, and people are really attached to how they imagine those things.
Yeah, and when it's different, they get really upset.
Yeah, which is why they hate adaptations. Yeah. But if it's very well described and everybody has the same idea of it, I think that links to some sort of greater success with something like a theme park, because everyone's like, yes, this is exactly how I imagine.
Or at least the source material was communicated in enough detail that everyone converged on a similar perception.
Right. And then there's more abstract things like poems or other forms of written language that have people can perceive them in many different ways.
Yeah.
And
maybe
that they're
intentionally
written that way. It's the same way that songs are specifically written so that people can insert their own story into that. So anyways, I think
Does music evoke imagery for you? As like maybe if it think about first without lyrics.
Imagery, I don't know, but I know that I insert my own stories.
Well, I mean, if you're imagining a story, I would assume that you're imagining some sort of maybe not imagery, because you could be blind and still experience some sort of series of events, but there are things. There's like a sequence of things that you kind of imagine in response to hearing.
Yes, and actually, to your point, I like thinking of what music video I would create for some songs.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's definitely imagery link. There's stories that I fill in, but the point is, okay, so what does the written word do to us? Do for us? It describes something so we can imagine, or it describes something enough. It creates some sort of structure of feelings that we can insert ourselves into and perceive it one way or the other, and it creates emotion through that.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the written word. So let's talk about photos. Let's talk about a still photo, image, or painting where it's just one scene represented at a time.
A picture is worth 1,000 words.
There you go. So I think that paintings have the same thing. They can be abstract and you can fill in your own story, or they can be very realistic. Photos, obviously, if it's like a photo
basically
means that it's supposed to be realistic. But the point is
photos can still evoke a bunch of when I say abstract, I mean like detached from what is actually presented there.
Yeah.
You can see exactly the image in front of you, and then your mind immediately adds a bunch of other thoughts, visions, concepts, things to it.
Yeah, that's why in film there are certain people that go by the rule every scene a painting, or people who are respected for that reason, because that means that literally they take care of every single frame you see to make sure that evokes a certain feeling, the same way a painter or a photographer would decide back in the day when there wasn't like a ton of digital options and you had to do like, one and done.
You had to choose between Nikon and Canon or whatever.
Then you really had to be specific about what you were trying to communicate and how you get that in one scene.
Yeah.
But that's visual. So what's the difference then between visual and what that gives us versus the written word? And right now, the way I think about it is that it helps bring our imagination to life. So I love talking about Twilight. I'll use that as an example. Well, now we're getting into moving picture, but let's just get into it. So
yeah, I think they're kind of synonymous. I mean, you add movement to an image when you see it.
Right. So I guess with something like Twilight, I read that book, and as with things like Hunger Games, Twilight, Harry Potter, these end up becoming successful in movies, no matter how bad they are, because we all want to see our imagination come to life. We want to live through it again, and we want to see, like, I imagined Edward, and I want him to magically appear in my room. Now, we always get disappointed because it's not going to be
it's not exactly
who it is, except, of course, I was never disappointed with Robert Pattinson, just to be clear. But it brings that to life. And now the challenge goes back to that whole spectrum of what is the benefit of abstract versus real, which is like we can insert ourselves. And as soon as we start seeing visual representations of something, I think it's harder to do that.
It's harder to abstract from it?
Because, the reason...
There's less room for additive visual imagination, at least, to the scene.
Right. So I think our imagination is at its maximum maybe when there aren't any words and it's just your imagination. But when there are words, it's guiding your imagination. And then when there's visuals, it's kind of just like, yep, this is what you should see.
Yeah.
So then your imagination might go into, I don't know what. Like, I guess how much of your imagination is involved when you're watching a movie? It's kind of just like handing it to you.
Yeah. I mean, like, where is there? I guess the question is, where is there room for interpretation in a movie?
Right.
It's not in what does the scene look like, which is usually where people go off the rails in different directions in books, or even in like a still image. You still maybe you imagine the movement differently, but it's a little bit more reined in when it's visually centered. So, like a movie, the room for interpretation then kind of gets abstracted up to, it bubbles up to relations, maybe interactions between different entities in the movie, whether that's the environment and a character or different characters and the dynamics between those different entities in the story.
I mean, I think it might just have to do with that it takes less effort. It's really easy to watch a movie. It's like I don't have to put any effort in and I can escape into the world that's presented to me. And it's a safe space for me to be a hero, kick a villain's ass, explore a new world. It's just a safe space that I am super passive at. Like the reason people were scared of TV and kids watching TV is they think it's obviously easier to do that than it is to read. Like it's known that reading is supposed to be better for your brain.
Because you have to put more active effort into it.
Yeah, you have to imagine it. You have to do the work to imagine that world that's being described.
Right, you're actively constructing it. Okay, the natural progression though from this point is, okay, well, that's just in a frame. So if we move forward to VR or video games, then there's even less imagination involved if we follow that train of logic.
Because I've been thinking about this. So now, up until this point, oh man.
We're digging ourselves into a really interesting hole, and
I know.
This is an enjoyable process to figure out. I think this is really useful because it's like a total devil's advocate of like, okay, well, if from that view there is less imagination, less active mental engagement. Meaning, if you want to look at it from like the Daniel Kahneman like thinking fast and slow perspective, there is the fast thinking, which is literally just everything you do passively. You observe things happening. When you use your slow brain. And again, this is just a model, but it's useful to some extent. Use the slow brain when somebody asks you a math question and you have to stop and think about it. Or somebody asks you to remember some specific thing and you're like, oh God, and you stop walking for a second. All these other automatic things stop and you have to think really hard. You have to do mental work, athletics to try to recall this thing or try to imagine some situation. That's the thinking process that for whatever reason we think is more educational or valuable when kids are reading a book versus when they're watching TV mindlessly.
So thinking fast is the mindless one?
Yeah.
And thinking slow is trying to actively work through it?
Sure. I don't know if this would actually be like, you would actually want to align these concepts from his official perspective, but I'm just going to use that analogy here for passive, very automatic things that don't take much active brain power. That's like just passively watching TV. Whereas actively reading a book, I mean, that does become an automatic thing. Like if you're practiced at reading a book, it doesn't take much effort to pick up a book and start reading it. That's a part of your brain that you've exercised and you get used to it. So like after, if you were to look at it that way, it's almost like the more you read books, the less useful it becomes to read books. If you want to say that the active, engaged thinking process is what's valuable. So like that's almost a misnomer.
Well, oh my God, there's so much to unpack there. I mean, if you say that the more you practice a sport, the less useful it becomes.
The less mental effort it takes.
Right. I don't know. I don't even want to go there.
So, that's just...
So a couple of things. Yeah. So one is, as you were saying that, I was thinking, the active versus passive thing, some of that is directed or, in other words, it's intentional, which is... A book is created to make you actively think pretty hard, like a Charles Dickens book, a mystery or something like that. Or a movie is harder to watch or to unpack versus a superhero movie. So I think that there's some like within each thing, someone can. First of all, there's like whoever created it wants it to fall under more active or passive. And then there's
one of those mediums.
The human involved. some people really don't want to. I was just reading Beloved with a group of people, and some people really didn't want to put that active effort in. She writes, Toni Morrison, who wrote it, writes in a form of poetry that is difficult. It's difficult to read, and you have to often reread stuff to think, did I understand what she was just saying?
Yeah.
And there were some things where we would end up talking about it, and I realized I missed it entirely, like big scenes where she wrote it in such a poetic way that I genuinely didn't get what she was saying. And that went in all directions. Everyone had different experiences with that. And some people really didn't like it because, and I think that was because they were unable to get in an active reading mindset.
Right.
And I mean, it's just like listening or something. It's like actively listening versus passive. So anyways, that's all like choice as well.
So, okay. So this is a really good point to bring up. So thank you for revisiting that. This is another genuine thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kelly. This is why these are great conversations. So like it's an oversimplification, essentially, is the point there. It's an oversimplification to say that reading is more mentally stimulating than watching a movie. Because you could watch a movie like maybe Shutter Island, which was that movie with Leonardo DiCaprio where like you're trying to figure out what the hell was going on the entire time and what was real and what wasn't. And like by the end of that, you're just like, what the fuck just happened?
Yeah.
It's not a relaxing experience. It's not something where you zoned out and just relied on your fast brain to just observe the story as it went. It's very much, oh God, what the hell is going on right now? I don't understand. So you're thinking, you're actively engaging the slow brain. You're actively engaging that sort of like deliberate thinking the whole time. Whereas you could also watch a movie or read a book that is easy reading or an easy watch. You put very little effort into it. It's literally just kind of like background noise to zone out.
Yeah.
You don't want to think while you're doing this. There are books like that.
Of course.
There's also pictures or paintings that are just like easy to look at and be like, oh, it's beautiful. Whatever. That's super pretty.
Yeah.
That's really, it's like, or like looking, I don't want to disparage everybody that's ever gotten to a mental rabbit hole of looking at cat pictures on the internet, but like I've done it too. And cat pictures.
Okay.
Like just like going down a meme rabbit hole where it's just like, oh, this is like straightforward. I don't have to think about it. Everything's just kind of funny or everything's just ridiculously cute.
Right.
You're not thinking much while you're doing that.
Yeah.
And the point is not that is inferior somehow. It's just you are mentally checking out a little bit and just kind of going into the fast brain autopilot.
Yeah.
In all of those mediums, it's not that reading is more engaged by default than movies. It's not that like that movies are somehow superior or that reading was superior, because there were easy and difficult parts of or examples of that particular type of content in that medium, no matter which one you're talking about.
I agree and I disagree a little bit, which is that I still think the visual is easier than reading. There is something, no matter if you're reading a children's book like The Dragon Eats Tacos or whatever that one is.
What? I've never even
Honestly,
heard.
children's books fascinate me. There's like a whole book about just how dragons love tacos.
Huh.
I'll figure out the name. Don't worry, you guys. Show notes. I'll link it. It's a great one. It's one of those children's books that you read and you're like, I could write a children's book.
Like, there's nothing stopping me from doing this.
Yeah, it's just like, I don't know. So reading that. Actually, children's books have images and words, so this is like a whole other thing.
Yeah. That's just an example of like,
right.
It's usually,
but I still think that there is something harder about that. It's like you have to. A lot of people read by saying the words out loud in their head, and so that's you're putting more effort in, no matter what, compared to just sitting back and having images light shot into your eye.
So your argument is that objectively, on some like physical level in the way that we process information, visuals are easier to process than written language.
I think I might be saying that, yeah.
Okay. What if you're
blind?
I
still agree. Okay, wait, hold on. I still agree with what I said that you expanded on, which is that the level, I don't think that one is active and one is passive. I think they both have versions of each.
They're both on that same.
But I think that people are more likely to watch a movie than read a book because it's easy. And people are more likely to go look at Instagram and look at cat memes because that's even easier than watching a movie that makes you think because of a story.
Right.
So people like easy things. We all do.
We're all mentally lazy. We literally we are. You don't. It's not pleasant to have your brain mentally engaged.
Right. Which is also why in the movies people like. Well, there's many reasons to this, but people love. There is an audience for the sequels and the superhero movies. It's just fucking easy to go in and watch something like that versus to watch Moonlight or something along those lines.
Yeah.
So, and then there's a whole studio side of that, which is that it's tried and true, and there's an IP they can rely on, and that's why those things are pumped out. But also there's an audience for them, so that all ties together. But so I do think that there is an easier thing when it comes to certain visuals. But yeah, I'm sure we could pick that apart, and there's a lot of modern art that is certainly not easy. So this actually leads me to
there's visual there was a trend, and I'm not in touch with modern art enough to make an educated statement on this. Outside of the fact that a lot of modern art became very simplistic in many regards, like literally framing a napkin on the wall. And you have to think really hard, why is that artistic? What the hell was the artist trying to communicate by putting a napkin in a picture frame?
Right.
What the hell is the point of that? But that's almost in itself the point, is that they wanted...
to fuck with you. I'm sorry, but I cannot stand modern art. I'm so sorry. I just can't. I remember seeing a red dot and them being like, this is World War II. And I'm like, come on. Just come on.
It's almost like they're literally giving you so little, such a deficiency of... or a deficit of visual input, visual information, that it's almost all imagination. Just generate concepts and visualizations around that initial tiny little trigger dot on the canvas.
I'm thinking of so many things right now. One is I started watching that show called Fleabag, which is a great show on Hulu, I think. And it's a British show. And bottom line, there's this scene where there's this stepmom who the main character can't stand, who's holding an art show. And she had one of her art pieces stolen by the main character because she can't stand her. And then she represents the art piece she's like, oh, I have a new piece and it's called Stolen Art Piece. And the stolen art piece was just an empty, it was I forget what those things are called, the little pedestal. Yeah. And there was nothing on top of the pedestal. And she was calling that art piece stolen art, which is just empty space. That cracks me up. Also, it's so funny because I was just thinking of this today, where in sophomore year of high school, I did a play that was called The Apple. And the concept of the play, it was brilliant. And the concept of this play was that somebody was eating an apple in a museum, and they placed the apple down on a pedestal or something, and it was partially bitten, and then they forgot about it, and everyone comes in afterwards wondering what the meaning of the apple is.
Oh my God.
And that's what the whole play was about. And I remember, this is totally pointless, but I remember that I think the apple was green maybe, and I said something I remember that my line had something to do with oh, what if the apple was yellow? And I was like, speed up before the apple turns red, and that got so many laughs.
Oh God,
it was so stupid. But I have no memory except for weird things like that.
Right.
Anyways, okay, so
I don't think we need to get into a debate over what the meaning of art is in this episode. Perhaps we can do that.
But I do want to dive into one thing. Okay. Which is, somebody recently was talking to me about the concept of, what do you consider good art? And this, and I know that this is a whole thing, but I'll try to, it is subjective, but I'll try to like reel this all back in, but it was basically that he defined it as something that really shocks you. So he's the type of person that likes Requiem for a Dream.
Right.
And
so I something that makes him think.
Right. And I like, well, I don't know. I'm like, Requiem for a Dream, I'm sorry, didn't really make me think, made me want to stop watching it. But
making you think too much.
Yeah, maybe. Because there's plenty of things that make me want to think that aren't just like so in my face.
Well, that maybe I would still stand by it. It makes you think so much that it's like literally overwhelming. You're like, oh God, this is so foreign or so different from what my comfort zone. It's so far outside my normal scope of my normal psyche, the way that I look at the world, that it's just too uncomfortable, and I'm going to turn it off because I don't want to, like, this is just unpleasant. There's not enough value in it that is worth you going through that mental discomfort. I
think to avoid just getting so off topic we can't come back,
right,
I'm going to say, okay, that's fine. And I'm going to pick up one word you said there, which was comfort, which is what this had to do with, which he felt like I said I typically define how much I like something by how much I want to re-experience it and re-examine it.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean like, oh my God, I loved watching some Adam Sandler movie a million times, which by the way, I didn't. But you know, people like, so yes, okay, that can be picked apart too. The more I watch something, that could be something stupid. But there's plenty of things that I feel like I want to read that book again right away or play that game again right away. And I define things as how much I like them by that. And he said that that's just soothing. That's not art, that's soothing. And so there was this whole concept there.
Wow. Okay. I agree with one aspect of what he just said, which is that, yes, there's very much like a comfort notion or a relatableness of it was a pleasant experience for you because either you felt like you were a part of it or you connected with it, or it was like it was relevant to you somehow and it felt right. And so you wanted to go through that again. So it was comfortable. It was soothing. But I don't agree that it's not art because of that.
I know. That's how I feel.
That is. He was saying it's not art because it was his subjective interpretation of, for him, art is not soothing. Art is, it makes you so uncomfortable that you have to think a ton about it.
Right.
It's not when things are comfortable. When things are comfortable, that's not art to him.
Right.
So like, art is actually like your idea of what it's what you idealize, which.
Right.
Maybe.
So, I know. Okay, so how do we reel this back in?
We're going towards video games, interactivity.
I know. Okay, thank you. And also, I feel like to bring that back in and connect it, I feel like all I'm doing is throwing stuff out there that will help us as we re-listen and try to like diagram it is what are some other lenses or elements. And some of what we've been talking through is, well, what is active or passive, what is easy or not, like what is comfortable and uncomfortable, because that adds something to these experiences as well and what they give to us or not.
I feel like it's really interesting that we are so like our psyche, our sort of mental ability and just experience of the world is so flexible that one person is able to develop an attachment to the idea of experiencing discomfort, like psychological shock of experiencing something like Requiem for a Dream, and then somebody else is able to attach their ideal to a feeling of belonging and comfort in the environment and like a soothing experience, and that the thing that the other person found as where they want to be is so drastically different. And that's just insane that we are that mentally, psychologically flexible that that's where like that subjectivity becomes infinitely broad.
Yeah, and
I
feel like
you can learn anything.
There's also so many reasons for that. Not to dive into it too much, but I feel like it's obviously based on things that are happening in somebody's life. I often see that one of my sisters and my mom want more easy passive things, but they're both nurse practitioners and deal with shit day in, day out. Like, of course they would want something.
Yeah.
They have one of the toughest jobs, right? They're looking for relief. Whereas somebody who doesn't have that, who's a bit more of an artist or a designer, is looking for that challenge on a daily basis. So, okay, so all right, bringing it back. So there's so many freaking...
It's like so
who's with us? Yeah.
Who's still here? If you're still here, yeah. If you didn't get lost
Congratulations.
in that fractal, tangential conversation, whatever. Video games is like the next step in this process.
Now this brings me to, so would you define any of the mediums we've been talking about as playing at all?
I feel like that term is kind of synonymous with a lot of how we look at the world, because you can almost describe like everything that we do in either that sort of play state or what were the terms that Evie was using to describe play versus non-play type experiences. They're like two mindsets. I don't remember exactly. She had literally had a doctorate on this.
Right.
This whole concept of play versus focus. But play is the exploratory, like creative, open-ended. It's just you're poking around, you're exploring the space, you're trying to figure out, or you're not trying to do anything actually. You're just exploring, wandering. It's creative. It's almost like it's not quite that sort of Zen state. It's kind of free form. Whereas the focused way of thinking, where you have a goal in mind and you're intentional about the things that you do. That's like the other state.
Right. So it was paratelic.
Paratelic and
which is motivation. Just to revisit quickly.
Real quick.
Well, I know that we had a note about paratelic, and which is also known as, so there's this thing called reversal theory, is a theory of personality, motivation, and emotion in the field of psychology.
Yeah.
It focuses on the dynamic qualities of normal human experience to describe how a person regularly reverses between psychological states.
There's two, though. There's paratelic and then not paratelic. What the hell is not paratelic?
The domains are telic and paratelic. So telic is serious.
Yeah.
And paratelic or playful.
Yeah.
To refer to whether one is motivated by achievement and future goals, which is telic, or the enjoyment of the process in the moment, which is paratelic.
Okay. To clarify, okay, we went over this with Evie many episodes ago at this point. There was telic and paratelic. Telic is the more focused state. It's like kind of goal oriented. It's motivated towards a particular thing. It's like you're trying to do something with intent, and then paratelic is the playful, exploratory, it's just like enjoyment of the moment. Okay. Paratelic or telic and paratelic. But your question was, are all of these things
My question was, so far, excluding video games, because we're about to get there, would you say that anything we've talked about in terms of storytelling, written word, visual images,
we could call all of these things representation,
motion pictures, would you call any of those play? Would you say that our interaction with them has anything to do with play?
No.
Okay.
And I wouldn't say that they're not play. What I mean is that they're not exclusive to telic or paratelic. They're not exclusive to play or focus. I think you could have a situation, or
I think they would fall under the mindset of enjoyment rather than achieving a goal. Enjoying for enjoying's sake, because that's maybe.
I actually feel
I think it could be both. Actually,
I actually feel like, so if you think of telic as being like more, you have to mentally focus when you're engaged to think more or use the slow brain. Maybe this we are drawing so many assumptions here, and maybe there's like some official views on this in the field, but telic, my assumption is that telic, or being more sort of goal and motivation oriented in mindset, is more active. You have to like actively focus on something, and you have to have an intent and a goal or thing that you're trying to do. And so if you're looking at a painting or reading a book that requires you to think a bunch in order to make any sort of conclusion about it, it becomes much more telic. Whereas if you're looking at something that's just very easy on the eyes, or it's a very easy read or whatever, it could be potentially a telic sort of exploration. Maybe you're just kind of like, how could you? Maybe. I'm trying to think of an example of like a playful space.
Where you're going, well, a sandbox, I don't know, a playground.
Yeah, but that we're getting out of the... So all of these things we've been talking about this far, the commonality is that we are taking something in the natural world and we are representing it.
Yeah.
I do think that it's a representation.
I think we've crossed into entertainment by now, right? Remember
Totally.
we had those categories. So I feel like we never fully answered the experience thing, but we're getting the connection. Well, I think we did to some extent. Okay.
We did. We started to get into the value
prop. It morphed into entertainment without us officially morphing into the entertainment category.
Yeah.
And perhaps it's all connected in some way.
That was one of my concerns when you brought up those, particularly those two, is because connection, and you mentioned this way earlier as well as a disclaimer, connection, like entertainment in itself can be like you could describe entertainment as the satisfaction of feeling connected with some sort of space. Or maybe you watch Game of Thrones because somehow you relate to and connect with that environment and that world, and so it's entertaining to you. What we haven't tried to define, and maybe we don't need to fully define this, is like, well, what is entertainment then? Is entertainment a satisfaction or a fulfillment from feeling connected with a medium, some sort of content?
Yeah, well, I think the reason it all relates, well, for all the reasons you said, but also what we had done is we went back in time to figure out, okay, to help us in this conversation,
the constraints.
What are the benefits of each phase of some form of
each medium?
Yeah. And then maybe we'll come back to some of those categories. Obviously, we're generally talking about entertainment, which is related to connection.
Yeah. Okay. So entertainment muddies the waters there because it's actually on a separate axis. We were talking about, the constraints of each medium and the different and the content. But this has
nothing to do with connection because we're not talking about... I guess what I'm getting at is I feel like we've gotten off track, but still on track in general, meaning like we're in the category of entertainment, but we've gotten off track from connection because connection is more like we would be talking about the history of social interaction and the history of personal interaction with things.
You can connect with anything. You can literally feel, so this is what I'm saying. You got to separate it. The whole point of us going through that exercise of like what is the benefits, what are the limitations of like written word, and what are the limitations of kind of like imagery and the space of what imagery accomplishes. Then we went into movies,
right,
moving, and then video games. But that is all entertainment can happen across all of those mediums. That's not actually useful to say that that we can define entertainment separately, but we were trying to move towards video games. Right?
Well, I hear you. Okay, so I will put a pin in this, but my brain is struggling a little bit because we went, in my opinion, off track from the connection part. But let's come back to that. And I think part of the reason we got into all of this is because we were talking about the imagination, the power of the imagination, the benefit, and then we got into these different mediums.
Yeah.
So let's come back at the end to see if we've made any conclusions about the connection part.
The connection ability.
But right now, I do genuinely feel like we are in the entertainment category more so than any other. That is what movies, books, and video games are.
And writing, and all of it is entertainment. That's why I'm saying it's not actually. If everything is entertainment,
I don't know what we're arguing at this point.
I don't think we are.
I'm saying all of the things that we are talking about right now are in the entertainment category, not the connection category.
I think so. My point here is actually that they're not actually different.
Fine. All right. We'll come back to it. I'll stop being annoying.
No, it's not annoying. The way I'm looking at it is that actually, and this is only through our conversation right now that I'm looking at it this way. I'm starting to conclude that you can't actually, like, you wouldn't relate to any sort of medium that is supposed to be entertaining unless you connected with it. So you actually have to have connection with with some sort of content in order for it to be entertaining to you. Maybe. But we can come back to that.
No, I think, yeah. Yes. And that connection can be created through that experiencing that medium, through the story or whatever it is through that medium. Meaning to have connection with something, sometimes people mean that by saying something already exists in you and you connect that with what's happening in that film.
You relate it to.
Or something. Yeah, but I don't think you need to relate to it. I think it's often the benefit of these things is escapism, where you're living something that you don't typically live. So that's where I might disagree with the with the connection thing. But you know what? Let's stick on the track of the video games and the play, and then
I think we can return to this.
Yeah, okay.
With a little bit more clarity.
Okay.
Anywhere where we disagree is a really interesting diversion and needs to be explored more.
Well, okay, so going back to the whole game, so the thing I was getting at is that games introduce play. So video games. So okay, games have always been around. Games have been around for a very long time in different forms.
It's agency.
Hold on. So okay. It's not just about agency. I mean, games always have certain goals. Like if you think about sports are games, or you think about board games or other forms, or like checkers or something like that, or chess. Games have been around for a very long time, and video games are an extension of games. They are not an extension as much of, okay, wait, I'm going to pause. They are a total mix. Yeah. And they're a total mix, but it does get complicated. But because they have the name game in them, and they mostly became popular for people solving puzzles or accomplishing a goal through them, they feel like a bit more like the sibling of other games and the cousin of the more storytelling, passive.
Okay. We need to separate some things here, because we need to unpack some things. This is like we're trying to describe this duffel bag of shit, like clothing, whatever the hell is in there. Maybe there's like old shoes, gym clothes. There's a lunch. We have no idea what's inside, and we're trying to call it things. And we need to unzip that thing, drag everything out, spread it out, and actually point at that shit and say like, okay, that's what that is. So there's a couple elements there. Games they are all of the other things we already talked about. They are representation with imagery or story described through verbal descriptions.
No, not always. If you talk about sports, you're talking about video games very specifically.
Okay, that is true. Okay, so maybe let's go back more fundamentally. But we are talking about video games. So
right, but it's very important to understand what a game means when we talk about video games.
So maybe we should stop for a second. Let's jump back and say, all right, there's been this whole sort of evolution of mediums through which we represent something. We represent imagery. We represent a story. We always associate stories with these sort of like progressions of events. And even if you're looking at a still painting, you imagine some sort of movement or a before and after of that painting. That imagery, even if it's a napkin on a wall, you start to try to think, what the hell is the surrounding context, the purpose of that thing? Why is it there? Why am I so confused? Whatever it is, you like want there to be more. Games, as a totally separate entity from that evolution, there's like it's a we call it play, right? There's an element of like you jump in there and there's artificial constraints, there's rules. You're supposed to try to accomplish a thing. So there's a set of goals in place. And it wasn't originally, games were not about representing a story. It was about putting you in some sort of competitive context.
Right.
Which we already, in one way, we do live in a competitive context at the most fundamental level, in that there's resources. Like, I need to get food. There's other people that need to get food. If there's not enough for both of us, we're going to have to play a game to figure out who wins and gets that food. So games are sort of like echoes in one perspective of that real world reality. That real world reality. Oh my God.
What's the difference between real world reality and base reality?
God damn. Okay, fine. Games are echoes of natural reality.
So, okay, yeah.
That's in one like limited scope. So they take into account like the real competitive nature of surviving in reality when there are limited things and you have to compete. That's totally separate. We could make a separation.
They're connected to that in some way because a lot of the times games have artificial rules and scarcity.
Right.
So, okay, games are very difficult to define. Like I'm kind of messing with you a bit there because so actually Jesse Schell, who's pretty well known for writing The Art of Game Design and also has his own game production company.
Okay.
So has a whole chapter about how do you define a game and the art of game design. Right. And I suggest a lot of people read that. It's pretty fascinating. But the takeaway is that it's actually pretty fucking hard to define. And at some point you might even get frustrated of like, why are we even doing this? Like who even cares, and how do definitions help us? But they help us in creating a language, right?
Yeah.
So the takeaway from that is that it's not easy, and sitting here right now, honestly, I feel like it would be best to like go through that chapter, everyone, as like
let's all read this
as
together.
Homework to try to define what a game means. It's not an easy feat, but I do think that there is an obvious difference between games and this other
representation.
Sure, we'll call it representation. Now, it's also known that the game industry gets really frustrated by people trying to make games into stories, or like it's literally like a comedy for some people when they try to have like, okay, there's the category for who wins best narrative game.
Yeah.
So there's a big historical struggle here between what is the benefit of a game, where do stories fit into that, and what is play? Where does stories and representation fit into quote unquote play or games?
How about the example of something like chess?
Mm-hmm.
It's very easy to look at that and imagine a battlefield and a bunch of entities. And it's very easy to imagine parallels of that to real battles that had happened in the past or may have. So in this, I think this is why it's actually hard if you try to completely isolate games from representation as like stories, because games in themselves kind of have a bit of a story arc to them at a fundamental level. So they're not, I don't know that you can actually separate them from representation. It's like, it's not so much that a game is about the visual, it's actually about representing the dynamics between entities in a situation. So it's a non-visual representation, and in that way it's almost non-visual art.
I love what you're saying about the whole story thing, and a few things come to mind. So if you think about sports, well, sports and competition, people like that just at face value. But when you add something like the story of the underdog, or the story of a player who had a rough background or upbringing, who made his way or her way to get to a certain point and master their sport, people love the story that surrounds a sport team or that surrounds a certain competition. And or like that Olympian who fell and broke her ankle as she landed in gymnastics and stood back up. I mean, related, I know that people loved with the people who made Myst. They loved the story of the creators, that they were brothers and that they were working together, and that the story represented brothers going through this adventure together.
So, okay, so at the fundamental level, I actually don't, now that we're talking through this, I don't think we should try to totally isolate game mechanics, which are really sort of representations of real world mechanics in a simplified concept or in simplified set of rules and environment. Just like art does not, not art, just like a visual, like a painting or a book, does not actually reflect the reality of that story in its full detail. It is a simplification of it. It's an abstraction. You can't, even a photograph, like a life-like photograph taken by a camera is not the full picture. It's just a small frame of that picture. And you get close enough and you're like, oh, there's details that you can't actually see here. I can't actually move closer to the things. I can't see what's outside of the frame. It's always a representation of that reality in some more digestible context. So games are like a simplification of the real complexity of competition or interplay between entities, things. So when we move from like movies to video games in the modern era, it's like the real crux there is almost starting to feel like it's the observer getting to take part in that game again. But there is a much more rich visual or auditory supplement there, a much more rich representation than you would get from something like chess, perhaps, or playing Go, or even playing baseball or something like that, like a modern game, a competitive game. A video game still takes all of those same elements, but it viscerally combines both. It takes in those game mechanics, and it takes in all of the representation from visuals and description and storytelling in that other tradition and combines them into one. And then you've got these extremely muddy waters of what does anything mean in that space? Because the observer has the ability to do things. They have, I think the difference is that they still have agency. I feel like that is a key difference at that transition point.
Well, right. I mean, to me, so the agency is a bit obvious, right? So this is the first time, all this is coming back to, this is the first time I believe we're introducing play into the mediums we are talking about, because we weren't talking about games. We were talking about written word,
right?
Various forms of storytelling, representation through art, then movies. And up until video games, we were not talking about games or play.
Yeah.
Games have their own situation going on, and video games have this weird mix of both. And what you're talking about with, okay, what does it do? What do video games do for you versus chess is actually really interesting, because I think that is very much a parallel to what is VR in many ways doing for us versus a real life experience. And I think it does have to do with something like, okay, yes, it's visceral, or it's bringing something to life in some way, but like, what is that really doing for you?
Is it it's the dynamic nature of the world that you were observing? So if you're watching a movie, it's very visceral. There are gameplay elements and everything involved in that story because there's different entities interacting and all of these struggles and whatnot. But you can imagine and fill in details in that world all you want, but it doesn't affect the external representation, the external medium that you are observing. As soon as you add in the ability to interact with that world in a video game, then suddenly your real-time actions affect the world that you are perceiving. And you enter a feedback loop that it was not there before.
Okay, so I get that, but that actually wasn't my question. I wasn't saying compare it to movies. I was saying compare it to other games. So yes, it's clear that you get more agency and control in video games when you literally have none in most movies. Like, let's ignore the new, like,
books, any
choose your own adventure books and shows that happen to exist here and there.
Right.
But when you compare video games to other games, what does it give you? Why do you like video games versus sports or something like that?
I feel like comparing a video game to a sport, it's like if you were to compare a book to a movie versus a baseball game to a video game, where you're engaging in a medium that has more like visceral input as far as how it's representing the world. So you have to imagine less of that actively, at least from that visual perspective. Whereas like a book, you're reading through the story. There's still all of those different dynamics and gameplay sort of elements of the characters in it. And then you move to a movie and all those story interactions and dynamics and gameplay among the characters still exists. There's added visual richness in the representation. Is that?
I get what you're saying. I'm pressing because just saying that you're adding visual richness doesn't seem to really do it for me.
Okay.
So because I'm, again, projecting into the future, into us, all of this leading to what is the benefit of VR, and if we just say there's a lot of visual richness, it's like, does that really sell it? And I'm just trying to really understand in detail.
Yeah, like I know.
What's interesting about what you just said is that it made me think back on what I did say the difference was between books and movies. And I said one is that movies are easier. Are video games easier than, let's say, sports? For example, you could also use other games. And I think, well, when you start to talk about physical stuff,
that's a totally different.
It feels different, but nevertheless, I feel like some people would be like, "Oh, obviously, sports are harder. You have to actually train and do all this stuff." But like, what do you think? Why do you think people are making millions of dollars playing esports or other versions of, or that famous video game?
It's a different side of physicality.
Yeah, it's a totally different. So it all takes practice. It all takes strategy. In many ways, they're all the same. So really, is it easier? Probably not. So maybe that would force me to look back on my whole, if you're likening it to the difference between books and films, maybe I'm wrong about the whole easy thing.
Yeah, I feel like saying that one is easier is
not the right description. Yeah. But okay, so think about it as like maybe related to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If one thing is taken care of, what does it do for the next thing? So if your effort in reading a book is to visualize it, then you can't focus on something else. All of your capacity is taken up to visualize or imagine.
Yeah.
But if that visualization is filled, then what's next? Then maybe you're thinking, maybe it enables you to escape faster. And what does escaping faster do? Well, if you escape into the world faster, maybe you can have an emotional reaction faster, which is actually very true because movies are shorter than books. Books take a really long time to get through, to immerse yourself, and then you come away with a lot of the same things you come away with when you watch a good movie or along those lines. So maybe it has something to do with that. So maybe with video games, it's different from other games in that you're not doing that. Like you had brought up the example of chess, or there's certain... You probably are adding some story where you have like the knights and the queens, or you're adding something to that already. And maybe what video games do are they enhance all of that. They give you this ability of like, okay, you can have all those challenges that more, I'll call it simpler without, that's not the right word, but more reduced games do without the visuals and all of that, but it's enabling you to just have more
mechanical
story.
Games,
yeah, so you're adding more story and visuals around that game, but what does that really do for you? Why do you like enriching visuals?
Like, why do I like playing a Skyrim type game more than playing something like chess?
Yeah.
Or why do I do it more often?
Yeah.
Or let's take Minecraft because it's more
because we just love talking about Minecraft.
Yeah.
I was excited to talk about Skyrim.
Okay,
for
fine.
once.
We'll talk about Skyrim then. It's the same.
No, you can do Minecraft if it's going to help your point.
Not for the. It's actually not much different. With chess, I am not imagining. I'm not even remotely imagining some grand narrative around all of my different pieces moving through that field as they are going against the other player, the other army. Because you're very much focused on the low level of just what are their next moves? Like, what are they trying to plan? You are focused on like an imaginary narrative of what is this other entity, this other person thinking? What is their sort of strategy? How are they going to try to take advantage of me? And maybe they are going to try to like catch my king or whatever over here because they're starting to move all these different pieces. But if you abstract up to the point of, all right, take care of imagining all of that and put me into Skyrim, which is this sort of like RPG, this very rich world and environment, and I don't have to. At that point, I am then given a very visceral representation of a world, and there's all these different entities there, and it allows you to then worry about things that are not necessarily just strategic. I mean, it's not even that you're still worrying about strategic things. You're just worried at a different level. Your scale of focus changes. Rather than looking at this game board and looking at wooden figures and trying to figure out where they're going to move, you're thinking about what is this particular opposing faction on the other side of the map planning to do, or like where might bandits plan to jump out from on this road as I'm wandering between these two different points. And I know that this person I talked to before up in the mountains gave me these goals to wander to the other side and meet with this mages college in the far north. So I need to get there, and there's all these different pieces at play and potential dangerous elements or things that could come into that equation and affect my ability to do what I'm trying to do. Or I'm more in a paratelic state where I'm literally just kind of, this place is so beautiful. I'm just wandering around. I feel like I'm just wandering nature. I feel a part of this world that feels living around me, and I'm not goal oriented right now. I'm not trying to accomplish something. I'm just exploring. I'm in a telic mood. Can you get into a telic mood in chess?
Of course. I mean, the whole idea of telic is that you're trying to accomplish a goal.
Oh, sorry. Paratelic. Can you get into a paratelic state of mind in chess?
Where you're just enjoying the experience? Maybe
you're
if you're really good at it. I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah,
and I don't feel like I have a good answer.
I feel like it's a lot more, like you have to automate so many. You would have to have such a higher level of automation of the activity of playing chess that you're just not worried about specific intent as you're playing chess. You're just kind of moving in reaction to things through like patterns that you've learned over time, and you don't even have to think about it. So like maybe conceivably somebody could do that. Maybe I do that while I'm cooking sometimes. I'm just grabbing things and I know kind of what works and I don't even have to think about it. And it's like a therapeutic sort of activity, but that becomes kind of a telic or a paratelic activity. But for some people, it takes a lot of mental work to think about what they're going to throw into a pot and like, oh God, what if all these things don't work together? Because they haven't automated those tasks in their mind yet.
It's all in the eye of the beholder in some ways, is what you're saying.
It's in the types of activities in that space that you have abstracted away, that your brain has learned how to do without thinking. So in an environment like Skyrim or in Minecraft or something like that, a video game versus just a simplistic game, a more simplistic mechanical game, you're focused very much on the mechanics of it. And for most people, that takes your entire focus. Whereas in an environment like a Skyrim, where it's this open-ended world, there are periods of time in that perceived world where you transition from a play mode to a very focused and goal-oriented mode, and back to a play mode. And you don't necessarily need goals in that space. And then other times you do. It's like it almost, what it's doing is introducing the sort of fluid complexity of an actual world outside of the constraints of a game. It's almost like video games like that actually lose. They are containers for sub-games. They contain many sub-games inside of that world, but it actually is in itself a representation of not just a space, like a painting, but it also fills in temporary dynamics of like, here's a bunch of different entities that are interacting. Here are different dynamics going on. And then maybe for a little while, you actually wander away from that and you're just back in this wandering state where there's not really any particular goal and you're just kind of exploring. So it broadens out the scope. It's a representation that doesn't just stick with a narrow focus on mechanics like maybe a card game or something does, or chess. And it doesn't only focus on the visual representation of a painting, or the sort of story description of the interplay of different characters in a setting of a book. But you're not just imagining that space and describing it to yourself by reading it. You're literally, you put yourself in there, and then you get to actually like poke and change things in that world and like affect it, just like you do in real world or in real life. It's like those types of games, once they hit the point of a visceral video game, become a reflection of a whole rich world.
Some of the things I'm hearing are it removes barriers to escapism. It opens up room for complexity.
It increases the complexity.
It increases, right? But I'm saying it opens up room in our minds to deal with more complexity. So well, more advanced games do this. Like the better it gets, the more realistic games became, or the more driven they are by interesting narrative versus like some of the more simple games when they first came, video games. I mean, when they first came out, it includes more and more complexity, or increases complexity, because we're able to handle those things.
Yeah.
And that has something to do with it's making something easier on us, like the visuals. And okay, so again, I'm working through this in real time as we're talking. Same. But so
where was the threshold that we crossed from feeling like the previous mediums were simpler to just a reflection of reality, of like the full complexity of reality, meaning that there are mechanical dynamics, there's like game theory involved, and there's representation, and you are a part of all of that. You're like muddied right in the middle of it and affecting it all and changing everything. Where did we cross the threshold from representing reality to actually stepping into it?
Well, it sounds like we crossed it when we talked about video games.
Yeah, so that's why I feel like it's when you give the observer the ability to directly take a part, like not in their imagination. You place the central observer, the self, into that experience, and they then get to be part of the world, not just imagining themselves as part of the world. They then don't have to worry about imagining what if I was in that world. They have to imagine what are my actions potentially doing to this world? What are the things in this world interpreting my actions as, and how will it affect them? And all of a sudden you're kind of like layered into that's when like all of a sudden, yes, the escapism aspect comes in. You keep saying that because it is kind of like you are now layering a simulated world on top of the one you already know.
So I think something that all of these mediums we're talking about right now are safe spaces for us to explore and to escape in some way. Now, escape is a tough word because I think we associate that with like pleasure. Yes. But I'm using it for lack of a better word right now because I think that it means to, I'll use maybe instead to experience something outside of what is our normal. And so, or to connect with some truth. So I think I feel like I have a million different like quotes that I want to read right now, but let's just say, so they're all safe places because they're not the real world where we can live a life through somebody else's eyes. Sometimes that is very different from our own, and sometimes it's actually feels extremely close to home. So either we connect with it because it's close to home, or we connect with it because it gives us a view or a perspective on the world where we get to be James Bond And we don't get to be that person in real life. But it's a safe space to actually explore what it's like to be that person, or for things to reflect a certain truth back to us that we kind of already know based on our own lives, but it feels like solidarity that somebody else has gone through it as well.
Yeah.
So what games do in that safe space is they allow us to try to have control, or give us a place. And I'm not just talking video games. So they give us a place where we have very clear goals most of the time. I mean, obviously some games are a bit loose about that, or they let us explore more. Yeah. But a lot of games give us clear goals, give us a clear, like, who wins, who loses. They give us an understanding of the rules. And we like rules and controlled environments and a feeling of control and agency where we can then control an outcome where we win.
Even in games like Skyrim, where it's a whole simulated world, it is still, there are so many elements built into that simplify the difficulty of understanding in real life.
Yeah.
Because you take a quest or something and you go and do that thing, and then you accomplish it, you bring back whatever you gained from that, and you've accomplished something. Or there's a storyline, there's like a central theme that you go through, and you manage to affect the world, and you can see that happening in some visceral way. Whereas reality is not always that satisfying in so many regards.
Yeah. I think that I had talked before about those 3 things. It was someone had written that there's psychological needs. One is autonomy. One is relatedness, or however he framed
connection,
it.
Maybe they said it differently. But.
Right. And one was control or agency in life.
Right.
Like to know that
what you do matters.
Yeah. And that, and that you can affect something. And so I think that movies and books, they don't give us any control. They don't give us agency. We know this for the most part. But they do give us connection, where we can feel like related to the people going through whatever they're going through. And maybe maybe it relates to that whole autonomy thing, where we feel almost some freedom in that quote unquote escape, where we can like go be something without the actual repercussions of being that thing. And or go see what it's like to see something we don't normally get to see, like experience World War II when we didn't really experience it, and in a safe way. And so what games do is they add that layer of, or video games at least adds that layer of, okay, so in that same safe space where I can escape into this world and I can live vicariously, or I can connect with this thing, also I'm going to add even more where I can control it in a safe space, and there's clear rules, and I can win or lose, and I always know that there's a way to win, which is one of the benefits of games. Like you almost never have a game where it's like I'm sure one exists, but it's like you don't you lose, but you know there's a way to win, which is something we don't get in real life. We don't have that feeling. We feel like we're winning or losing, and there's nothing reassuring us that we can always win, where games give us that control.
I want to agree with a lot of that, but then I'm also thinking about a lot of that is very subjective. A lot of people, I'm pretty sure, go through life feeling like they're constantly losing and like there isn't a way to win.
Isn't that what I just said? I was saying that people go through life thinking that's why they like games, because you know that you can win.
I don't necessarily think that's the case. I mean, I like games, and I don't actually feel like, I don't think those two need to be tied together, is what I'm saying. I don't feel like there's no way to win at life. Winning is to me, is a temporary, contained situation that you come out on top of. And then after that, you're confronted with whatever the next situation is, and like the previous win doesn't actually matter at that point anymore. It's contained. And so I view regular life like that. Games don't actually mean much to me on that, because of that regard. They're not different in that regard. So I don't know that association necessarily distinguishes.
Do you prefer games over movies?
Yes, kind of.
Why?
Because movies feel more passive, and I like playing a part.
Why do you like playing a part?
Movies are not necessarily, I don't want to say games are superior to movies. They are different specifically because I don't have any effect on the storyline. Me, Jay, I can temporarily project myself into the environment and observe these characters and whatnot. Maybe I can even go to the length of, I feel like this happens more often when I read a book, but you can go through the length of watching a movie and feeling like you are one of those characters, because you empathize with them so strongly. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how much I think about it. The storyline of that movie doesn't change. I can subjectively interpret it differently.
It's somebody else trying to tell you something.
It's framed. It's on rails for, like, what happens in there. You can observe it again and interpret it differently. But that's it's kind of the limit of the flexibility, right? That's the control that artists like in mediums like movies or a painting, and obviously that only goes as far as you can establish the information there, and then people subjectively interpret it however they want, but there's a limit. Whereas in games, there's like a stark reality that you can set up the environment that you put somebody into, but then people are going to do whatever the hell they want in that space within the constraints of, like, the physics there. That could be Tetris. Literally, like, somebody can figure out a way to basically game Tetris and play it in a way that would seem like cheating and seem frustrating as hell to the person that actually built it. You could also do that in something like Skyrim, where you do something that the original creators never intended someone to be able to do in that space. But it's almost like saying God never intended humans to do half the things that they do in the world. But we have the ability to just come up with all these crazy contrived things, like eating gasoline or whatever. It literally, anything that it seems like it would be ridiculous within that context, the bounds of what is reasonable there kind of break down because of how freeform it is. So, like, the representation in that environment, in that space, really gets boiled down to what is the setting that you put in place, and then what are the limits of that entity, that character, the person, to go in there and actually affect the environment and change it. Minecraft is so interesting there because you can literally just everything can be changed, rebuilt, reconfigured.
This is so fascinating to me because I feel like that's why I don't like Minecraft. I'm like, oh my God.
It's overwhelming.
There's too many options. I don't know what the point is.
What about real life?
I just want something to be handed to me that I can, I don't know, like, I prefer movies to games. So I'm the other side of that.
It sounds like you look at it as a totally different thing. Like it sounds like you have one particular thing that you get out of movies, and that's not what you get out of games, which I don't blame you for. I don't think they're the same.
Well, just to think this through out loud.
Yeah.
So there's, so as you were saying that, I'm thinking about how video games, if we talk about some other lens and the million lenses we're looking at, there's like effort. And I think video games have the most effort so far of things we've talked about, more so than reading. So like it would be like the highest is games, or including video games, then reading. Or there's probably, that's a tough one. And then movies.
We're talking about agency. The agency is the effort, I think. Or are you talking about the imagination of the environment?
When I talk about effort, I'm like, how hard is it to, how do I say this? There's something passive and easy about throwing on a movie.
Right.
When I open up a book, my brain turns into a certain mode that's more active. When I play a game, it's even more. Because it's not that I'm just like reading something. Like, I can kind of choose in some ways with a book how active I want to be or not.
Right.
And I'm letting it all wash over me. Some books are harder than others. But with a game, it's like I'm all set up. I mean, if you watch videos of people playing, this is what would tell you. What does somebody's face look like when they are playing a video game, reading, or watching a movie. And I swear, playing video games is like the obvious, like people's faces look like they are in pain half the time, or like they're laughing, like they're going through a lot, and they are very focused. And there's actual proof of this. I think this woman did this who, or at least she talked about this. We can link it, but there was this talk about how games move us. I'm blanking on the woman's name, but she also wrote a book about this, and it's pretty fascinating. And in her talk, she shows some other study about somebody videotaping people playing games, and their faces just look like crazy. Yeah. And just by that, it's like you could argue that video games take more effort, or they're more involved just by how our faces look when we're playing them.
I feel like it's probably an oversimplification, because I would immediately want to know, what kind of games were they playing in that research? Were they playing something that took a lot of focus? Because it does not take a lot of focus to wander around an open world video game. And it's almost like it's not fair to call Minecraft and Tetris video games.
What?
Because one of them, I mean, you have agency in both, meaning you are directly deciding, where does that block go? Cool, where does that block go? And then in Minecraft, you're also, funnily enough, you're also working with blocks, because the whole world's made out of blocks, but it's like, it's so much more free form, and you can do anything. You can not focus. Half the time what I do in Minecraft when I play that is just wander. I'm like, wow, it's so pretty. Look at that giant valley, and like, oh my gosh, there's crazy mountains over there, and whoa, look at that cave. Holy shit, this is amazing. Or other times I am very focused because I'm trying not to die by being eaten by skeletons, or like I'm trying to very carefully place some blocks to build a mansion.
Even the way you described exploration sounds like way more effort to me than watching a movie. And here's why. You're already deciding which direction you're going to walk in, and like observing things in each area and deciding a feeling about it, rather than being presented with just like a shot of what you're supposed to be looking at.
What do you mean what do you do in real life?
No, what I'm saying, I'm not talking about real life. I'm talking about the difference between movies and games.
That's what I'm saying, is like, do you...
In real life, yes, it's literally harder to walk around and explore and look at caves than it is to watch a movie and sit on my couch eating popcorn, drinking wine with pictures presented to me.
Okay, yes. Okay, yeah.
Okay, so basically what we've determined is that I'm lazy as fuck.
No.
And I prefer movies to games.
To real life? No. Okay. Yes.
They all have a place in my heart.
Totally. I don't want to say one is superior, inferior, whatever. But the difference there is that, like, in real life or in a game, you have to decide at some point, I look that way. I'm going to look that way. What am I going to do? I'm going to focus on that block. I'm going to focus on that block. Cool. Movies or even books, you don't decide in a book that you're going to describe that other mountain range over there, or that you're going to describe the character doing a different thing. You're still on rails. Yeah, you have to viscerally produce more imagery and environment in your mind, but you're still on a track of someone else's agency. They decided what the focal point was going to be.
Yeah.
That's the difference.
I love where you're going with that. I think the word decision is one that is important. And I often hear about agency.
That's what I mean.
We talk about control, right. And it's true, but for some reason the word decision seems to resonate with me a bit, because agency means that you have a certain control. But the next step is, what do you do with that? You have to make decisions. That's really what it's all about. That you get the opportunity to make decisions that have an impact. Agency just enables that. And so it sounds to me like what you like about games is the ability to make decisions and impact things. Yeah. Which is like an obvious, I feel like, okay, fine. What I still don't get is why you like that. Why do you like making decisions?
I think it's not that I like making decisions. It's that I don't, and this is very much subjective to me, I don't like
not making decisions.
I don't like being constrained from making decisions. I don't like not having the option. Like I would despise. I don't like being on rails as much.
But why? Why? God.
I don't know. That is I feel like this is a totally, a worthwhile conversation that maybe for another night, but like, let's put a pin in this.
Okay.
Let's put a pin in this for later.
About it. Okay.
The basically, like, what is appealing? Like, why do some people really enjoy having more direction, or like lack of, or not needing to like make those decisions at every point, and then other people like far less structure, more chaos. I don't know what you want to call that. It's like it's like a preference of order versus chaos in your regular environment.
Right. Okay. Fine. And bringing it back, I feel like all of this is leading to us trying to figure out how we talk about the value of XR.
Yeah.
And in talking about entertainment, well, the idea is that it all relates to, if we can't even figure out how to talk about what is the value proposition of books versus movies versus games, of course, it's hard to talk about what is the value proposition of VR. And we just get stuck in this cycle of being like, it's more immersive.
It's connection.
Right. It's like, use our words. I think that
this is a hard battle to slog through to get to that point, though.
Right. So. But so I do think that while we haven't quite solved or really been able to figure out the best words to dig into more of that, the game and the play and the benefits of decision making and agency versus what more passive experiences or prescriptive experiences can do. Yeah. I do personally believe that VR and AR, XR in general, is meant for both.
Totally.
There are a lot of people who don't think that. They think that it is, if you aren't using that, they basically say that the huge differentiator for VR is that it's like that it's taking that video game first person perspective agency and amplifying that because you have
getting rid of the
360
screen.
perspective.
Yeah.
It removes even more barriers to having that experience. So I get that. I totally get that perspective, and that I do agree that there is something about when it removes barriers to our imagination. There are things we can do in VR that we can't do anywhere else. I talked about this in the episode with Jude when I talked about that experience where you can fly up in the air and hang out with famous people in that flight one. I linked it in last one's show notes if anyone's curious. So, and that's the same with video games. You can literally do things. You can fly. You can do things that you can't do. And the same with movies. Like, all of this is really about imagination and doing things that either you can't do in real life, or it's some sort of resonating, like telling you a truth that you already know, where you're connecting with something that, through the lens of somebody else.
I almost feel like we might be drawing an artificial distinction between a video game and a interactive VR experience. I say that because the way that I've been thinking about it this whole time is that there are frames. Like there's frames in video games, there's frames in movies. Books are contained within that book, and then you imagine it. But when you imagine the story in a book, or you imagine the setting in a painting, you take that representation and then you internalize it, and the borders are gone. Mm-hmm. You associate it with all these other things that are not contained within a painting frame. They're not contained within a book physical form. They're not contained within the movie screen. It's all this other context and outside of the frame information that you then glom onto the idea.
That's in the frame.
Yeah. The frame is just kind of like, it inspires all of that other stuff.
Yeah.
So like, it's the difference between like a video game and a movie on that track, or like books and whatnot, is that one is on rails, one is prescribed experience, and the other one is open-ended experience where agency comes into play. It's not actually that video games in a frame are so different from VR because you lose the frame. It's only that it becomes easier to forget the frame.
Right, but
in VR.
Yeah, so why is that beneficial?
What do you mean?
Why does losing the frame do anything for us? What does it do?
Getting rid of the frame makes it easier to suspend disbelief in one way of looking at this. It's very hard for some people to look at an open-ended experience where you have agency and you jump into that world, like has happened with many people in like Skyrim or Minecraft. They're experiencing that in a screen, right? But they can think back to lots of different experiences and they don't remember a screen. They remember actually being there in that place and doing things. It's not that it happened in a monitor. You can do that in VR too, but it's much easier to forget about the artificial aspects of that experience because it's more visually encompassing. It takes over your entire field of view. There is no frame anymore. So it's easier to suspend disbelief. Now, we talked about this earlier. I wanted to bring this up and it now makes sense. D&D, role-playing games, there is literally no screen. It's all imagination. There's no book to look at. There's just a person describing things to you. So it's actually more similar to a book, but it's literally just, let me describe the scene to you. Here's where you're at. What do you do? Here's your agency. Here are your rails. This is where you found yourself. This is the environment. And then here, make some decisions. Think about how you want to affect your environment. And when you look back on that experience, if you really got into it and you accepted that this was the world where you were at, you remember those experiences that were completely described. It's a bunch of you sitting in the middle of a living room. There was nothing actually happening, but all of you have this shared memory of this activity where you were deep underground in some crazy cavern and all of this stuff was happening. And you can all talk back to that point like it actually happened. There's this shared memory that took place between all of you. And none of it was actually viscerally there, but it's the common element with different levels of like immersion of a video game or VR is that suspension of disbelief was reached. It's a lot harder to do it in that perspective. It's a little easier to do it in a video game because it's just presented to you in some capacity. And then in VR, it's even easier because your whole field of view is taken over. Maybe you're getting auditory feedback as well. Maybe you're wearing a haptic suit and you literally feel it. So in one capacity like that, VR and XR lowers the barrier to entry for someone to feel immersed in that space, and like that is an extension of that ability.
In total agreement with you, one of the things that pops into my mind is that you stop having to pretend you're actually doing something. So in the D&D example, it's like, imagine you're in this scenario and you describe it and everyone's imagining that scenario. And then in VR, you're saying, no, literally, we are in this spot. Look around. There's the castle. There are the goblins. We need to get past whatever.
Yeah.
So I totally agree.
We could paint that same picture in every single tier, every single setting, like D&D, video game, VR. Same setting.
Yeah. I mean, that is always the case to me. I've always gotten super frustrated when people are like, oh, but why VR? Or why would you do that in this particular medium? It's like, what you just said is totally true to me, which is that you can do a scene in all of them.
Yeah.
You can apply it in any way. And I'm sure there are pros and cons to all of that. Like, when you're reading something, you get so much description that it makes you think about things or picture things sometimes even better than when you're just looking at them, because you're appreciating the way in which somebody decided to describe those things.
Yeah, maybe you're getting more immersed in it than when you were just looking at a screen.
Right. So I agree with that. The suspension of disbelief, and that you stop having to pretend, you get to actually do something. And I could see that being a pull, which is you want to fly, you can literally go fly. You want to, I mean, and I think that with it's harder. It's a bit harder for me to try to find the right words to describe that difference between video games and VR, because you can do all those same things, but you don't get so a great example actually might be a roller coaster. You can't do a roller coaster in a video game and get that drop in your stomach, but you can in VR.
You can a little bit. But it's like
no, you can 100% get that feeling.
Totally. I totally agree with you. Because at that point, it's like, it's just how much of your field of view needs to be tricked for you to start actually physically feeling sick.
Right.
And I mean, you can get up really close to a monitor and obscure enough of your view with the perspective of going down a hill or dropping off a cliff, falling, whatever, that your brain will start to
imagine that's what's happening. It's like in those IMAX theaters, it does that. Yeah,
there was a really good article on this of there is the uncanny valley where you kind of get to a point where the reality, the portrayal that you're looking at feels really, really close, but it's just not quite close enough, and you're just like, that's not real.
Yeah,
something about that is off. It's just not. It's so close, but it's not there, and therefore I am going to disbelieve what's happening. And then the article's whole point was that there is a second valley after the uncanny valley, and that is one in which it becomes so real that you can be aware still that you're in a simulated experience or something, and then go a little bit further, and all of a sudden you're not able to disbelieve what's happening. Your body literally responds as if it's real, and you can't stop that.
It's so much suspension of disbelief.
So much suspension.
Which, by the way, we do actually talk about that article also in an upcoming episode. But
right, we did.
Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
So that's more context there. Yeah, a little. So
little plug.
Okay. I still think that there is. It's almost like I don't even want to talk about it anymore. Fucking tired, man.
Oh God, what was?
But so here's, I'll say something here, but we don't need to pick it up in detail. It's like for future, which is, here's what's weird to me. At some point, I think I brought up this book that's called Understanding Comics. And something it talks about is that there's this difference between, or the spectrum of abstract to real. And we like stories that give us space to like space between the panels, like in comic books, where we can fill in our own story. So in that sense, too abstract, we can't follow it. Too real, and we can't insert ourselves. So sometimes when you talk about that filling in that blank and making everything real, where there is no, like, the frame has given us those panels in a way, and we fill in everything else. And with books, we fill in a lot in our mind. And then with VR, like, if it's all being filled in, well, then you could almost argue that could be a bad thing, because it's like that the valley after the uncanny valley, because
it's like too prescriptive.
It's too prescriptive.
That happens with regular stories. Like, if the story is too predictable, you literally are able to anticipate everything that's going to happen, and you realize you're observing a story. Right. Again, you get pulled out of that immersion, and your disbelief comes back, and you're just like, this is just a story. This is stupid. Look at all these plot hooks and whatnot, and like all these different literary tools that they threw in there, and this is so fake and contrived or whatever. All of a sudden, you're not able to be immersed in it anymore because it's so prescriptive that you realize you're on rails.
Yes. Interesting. So I think there is maybe an element of surprise here that you're talking about, where I like being on rails when I like the movie, when I'm like, ooh, what's going to happen next? Yeah. Or I'm just so into it, I'm just very involved in what is going to happen to this character that I'm living this through, the main hero. So now when you get into something like video games or VR, if there's so much filled in for you in description about the world, or you can actually live in it, it maybe takes away certain elements that you fill in, and so then kind of going back to that hierarchy of needs, it's like, okay, so now that you have all that, you need something else. You need that control and surprise based on what decisions you make and that agency within the world that you have where you can impact that world. It's like you need something more now.
In something like Minecraft, there's actually lack of prescribed story.
Yeah.
There's lots of gamification. There's lack of prescribed story, though, which if you compare it to like regular life, there is lots of gamification. There's all kinds of different incentives and motivators that you encounter that push you and pull you in different directions. There's also when I feel like we deal with this all the time. Like when you enter in a situation where you don't know what the direction is, you don't know where you should go next. You don't know what your purpose is in that space. You're so overwhelmed by all the new information that's when you run into things like imposter syndrome because you don't know what your value is. Or you feel super out of place because it doesn't feel like your purpose is actually aligned there. Or you don't have direction and you just feel really anxious that you're like, where the hell am I even going? What am I doing right now? What does any of this mean? That is something that we do get relief from by watching or reading through a story that it's that balance of just prescribed enough that you feel like there's a direction, things are going somewhere, but it's not so contrived that you lose the ability to ignore that structure. You lose the ability to imagine that this is actually a real world. And suddenly you realize, oh, no, somebody built this. Like this is all just architected from the top down.
Yeah. Okay, here's what I want to do. What I really wanted is to come to some sort of conclusion.
Yeah,
and I feel like I just have 5 million more questions. I need to re-listen to what we've said. We need to whiteboard some diagrams.
We do. You want to do like thoughts on thoughts on thoughts?
Yeah. Well, I think that this should be to be continued.
Totally.
Because first of all, we're tired right now.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to think about. I'm also very curious to hear from people listening.
Yeah.
Like, I just want to know people's thoughts about this and if they have language or ideas that might help us work through this and really figure out how do we talk about the value of XR through examining how do we talk about the value of other related mediums. Because we need to understand the foundation before we understand the rest. So
because it's not so much what is the value of XR. It's actually more of a question of what is the value of mediums of gameplay and storytelling in general.
Or related, okay, well, what is the value of connecting with nature? Now let's add to that. Okay, so if you do something like that through this type of medium, then what is the same or different?
Yeah.
So I feel like we tried to tackle a lot, and
I think we made some progress.
Yeah. I mean...
I feel like I'm in a very different mental space than I was when we started.
Yeah. So, okay. This is to be continued. Totally. We'll re-listen. We'll work through it. We'll continue working through it. And I think also our conversations, like the continued discussions we have with guests, is going to help us as well. This will be a continued refining process. But we definitely love to hear people's thoughts and feedback, whether through our website, which is realityquestpodcast.com, through Instagram, which is at realityquestpodcast, or Twitter, which is at reality_quest. Genuinely, like, we'd love to hear it. We'll include your thoughts in the next one.
The good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between.
We'll start yelling at you like how I yell at Charlie when he shares his thoughts.
We basically had a whole episode just now on in reply to Charlie.
No. I mean, maybe.
In a way.
Shout out to Charlie. Love you. Okay. I mean, sweet.
This was a good conversation.
Yeah.
We enjoy it, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully you guys get something out of this, and thanks for listening.